continue à parler en salle. Oui, il va essayer de faire le guide entre les différentes interventions. Voilà, il a le... Je continue à parler sur le floor. Oui. Tout dernier test pour interaction et interprétation. Nous sommes à la présidence française de l'Union européenne. C'est l'événement numéro 3, cybercriminalité. Nous sommes actuellement au PMF, Bercy. Est-ce que vous m'entendez? L'événement est co-organisé par le ministère de l'Intérieur. Est-ce que je peux... Oui, il arrive. stage.
We met at Google.
Yes, exactly.
Hello, I'm Markus Meyer, the president of the FATF. You just recently wrote a letter to me, so I thought maybe I should say hello. Yeah, very good that you're here and
very good that we
the
meet.
introduction. Yes, yes, yes. Yeah,
My
yeah.
colleague, I'm not just. Oh, the minister's not.
Ah, okay. Yes, yes, of course. Yeah. Ah, hello. I can get a camera if you want.
My colleagues here.
Ah, okay, okay. You can take a picture. Yeah. Great. Okay, so you're coming to Berlin next week or so, right? Yeah, to talk to German Finance Minister, to everyone. Yeah. No, that's good, that's good. No, I commend you for the AML package. That's really a great progress for Europe. And I hope we get it with the cash transaction pressure. Yeah, from Germany, I know. Yeah, I know. They even want to go down to 5,000, which makes sense. It's a sensitivity in Germany, but I think if you have convincing arguments, for example, you reduce bureaucracy, right, for all these people, the SMEs, so I think that's a good argument, especially for people who are liberal Democrats. Exactly. Yeah, Austria, yeah. Because they have something in their constitution. But that's still an out under your regime.
Maybe €10, but
That's another argument for your package, because between private people it's still possible. It's in the business area. I mean, there it makes a lot of sense. Because that's the risky part.
Exactly. But I want to do, if you don't mind, I want to check here because I was checking before.
Okay, so I just wanted to say
well,
hello.
I may see you, but
Okay,
great to see
okay,
you, and
great.
appreciate the support.
Okay, thank you.
Also at the French Presidency.
So you're a proud Parisian now?
Part, yeah. My mom is here. So, I think I had, if this pandemic had been done, right? But now I'm doing everything.
Not so sure. I may just do this.
So you are running nearly every session today, right?
In the morning.
In the morning.
I need to organize.
Everything fine on you?
Yeah.
Staying away from the virus?
I got control this morning.
Okay, so then good luck.
I think I use a script rather than my iPad. Yeah, it's easier. Sometimes.
All technologies are best.
And I decided I needed to change the password. As I was I explained to the deputies. I wasn't stuck. I just didn't go. And for me?
Yeah, so the four speeches, then there will be a sequence dealing with basically the supervisory and regulatory aspects. And then because Mrs. Schiappa will have left, just your colleague Ylva Johansson from Brussels will have a little bit of Q&A on the more law enforcement aspects.
So she speaks last year. I don't want to ask the questions.
Sorry?
We're not going to the. She's on camera.
Yeah, so I think it will be sequential.
Test, 1, 2, 3, testing, English channel. Good morning, can you hear me? Hello? Just tell me when to stop. Dites-moi quand c'est bon, ok.
So, initial remarks are out of my hands. And then I've been told to finish at the hour at 10. So that's exactly. That's my parameter. If you put yourself in my shoes,
I've been
you
in
get
your
that.
shoes.
Exactement. On a tous les pouvoirs. Exactly. Unplugging easy. I have to say,
My colleague Ylva has a really strong speech. It's a really good end. It's like a really well.
that's very good. We can comment on the issue between the US and Europol, because that's one of the current drivers of the news flow. So, I may, if she left it. Let's see the news.
You know she's not from.
Oh, she's in Stockholm.
I know that she was part. I don't know where she's doing.
Taiwan today.
Oh, the easiest.
Oui, je vais dire un mot et je vous passe la parole. Bonjour.
Good morning and welcome to all participants on the Bercy, here in Bercy, but also those of you who are joining us online from across Europe and even across the world. My name is Nicolas Véron, and the French authorities have kindly asked me to be the moderator for this morning's session of the conference, and I'd like to give the floor straight away to the Minister Olivier Dussopt.
Bien, mesdames et messieurs.
Ladies and gentlemen, Minister Delegate, Commissioners rather, because in fact we have the great fortune of having Commissioner McGuinness with us today here in Bercy, and to be able to also welcome one of her colleagues by video conference, Madame Yosso, who's also participating in the conference. Ladies and gentlemen, Director Generals, Procurator Generals joining us here or remotely. I'm very pleased to be able to welcome you all here today at the Ministry for the Economy, Finance and Recovery to have a discussion on our fight, to hold this conference on the fight against financial crime. It is co-sponsored by two ministries. We're really pleased to see that we have these eminent specialists here with us today. I think we're going to have an excellent high-quality debate during the course of our proceedings, and I'm very pleased that the French presidency has enabled us to meet again in this context and within this setting. The French President, Mr. Emmanuel Macron, developed on Wednesday to the European Parliament what exactly the vision of our presidency is. Given the disorder that is returning, we need to protect the citizens of Europe. That is a key part of the building of Europe, and we want to make sure that the European presidency is a time in which we actually take action to protect the citizens of Europe. Now, protection means that we've got to have the right tools, not to be armed against one another, but to ensure that we're able to master our European space, to protect our internal markets and our fundamental freedoms, be they political or economic. And this is really what's going to inspire all of the debates which we will be holding during the coming months, in order to protect our jobs, to strengthen our industry and to invest in the future, to protect our consumers against fraud, to protect economic operators against ruptures which can be occasioned by Brexit or the health crisis, protecting the environment as well, while at the same time protecting companies in Europe faced with the green transition that is ahead of us. And the subject to come back to the subject which has gathered us here today, I think it's a great shame to see that too many European citizens really have no idea how much their safety and their security depends on our public action in the areas of economics and finance. Money is everywhere. It's at the very heart of war, and the money laundering is actually what is behind all fraud in many, many forms. We see this through financial flows, and we've got to trace this wherever possible through large criminal organizations and networks, drug traffickers, financial fraud, tax fraud, organised or not, consumer fraud, fraud of social aid, and even as we've seen during the health crisis, we've seen fraud of the emergency systems. We've seen customs fraud, counterfeit. We've seen terrorism and radicalisation, which has affected many of our countries, which is why we need to react. We can see that the architecture of fraud bases on the same thing. We've seen financial networks which are based on microfinancing schemes, which we need to detect and undo. We no longer have physical transport of currency, but rather we've got much more sophisticated circuits where there are different networks collecting, financing, setting up legal montage and fake companies or taxi companies, as we call them, which are difficult to identify. They also see them using other sectors such as the art world or the property markets to cover their activities. This is not something which is new in Europe, but we're now seeing the extent of it. In 2019, 117 to 210 billion euros of suspect transactions have taken place within the financial system in Europe. We wonder how things have gotten so far, and I think the situation is very, very complex, and we need to make sure that we have mobilization of all authorities within the European Union if we want to counter this. And in particular, we call upon the financial intelligence units called TRACFIN here in France, but also we've got to call upon our legal authorities. This is a daily, something where we need the daily commitment of the people in the private world, from banks, insurance, from law, from the art world, the crypto assets holders, professionals in the art market, property market, betting. We also need to have the registrars from our commercial courts, sports agents and lawyers who've got to be our relay points in this combat. If we want to properly fight against the laundering of financing, we've got to make sure we have the regulation which is properly used, properly known. We've got to make sure that we use all of the obligations that are possible. This is really one of the conditions for proper financial integration within the European Union and a prerequisite for the freedoms of the internal market. During the course of today's discussions, I will be happy to salute the daily work which is being carried out by these players for the general interest in France and across the European Union. And here again, I think we must flag up the fact that too few Europeans understand to what extent the legislation at European Union and the cooperation that is organised between member states through Europe, the weight of their policies and their regulations make our action credible. Too many people feel that Europe in this area and many others is simply an area where obscured regulations are churned out. But I would like to actually change people's opinion of this. The first point is important, and it is that if we want to have free circulation, which is really at the heart of Europe, we have got no options but to be ambitious in our actions. In an integrated market like the European Union market, our fight against organised crime and money laundering has got to be united. The criminal fine, unless we are integrated, that is the weakest link. We have got to ensure that we implement these texts in a homogeneous fashion, and because our weaknesses can be exploited by criminals. Secondly, the European Union has always been at the forefront of our fight against money laundering and has had a framework for anti-money laundering for a long time, which has been strengthened with giving recommendations to the Financial Action Task Force. We know that we have now got a strengthened text, new directives on money laundering and a directive on the exchange of information, and numerous flexible legal texts which enable us to actually make sure that this can be adopted by national authorities in the private sector. More recently, the European Union has been able to give proper effectiveness to these standards. Action plans coming in 2018 and 2020 have shown us how important it is that we generalise our tools for financial transparency, making sure that we understand who the beneficiary owners are of every transaction, and that we strengthen our daily cooperation between the FIUs. We believe that we will not get to the end of this either at a regulatory point, from a regulatory point of view, or a operational point of view. We're going to be hearing from the Commissioner very soon, and thanks to her presence here, we're going to be able to hear what the European Union has been doing and be better informed of the legislative package presented by the Commission on the 20th of July last. And I'm looking forward to hearing what you have to say. But we have to understand how important it is to increase and harmonise our action at Union level. We've got to ensure that we have proper supervision at European level. We've got to strengthen the financial intelligence units, and we've got to strengthen the role of the agency, the dedicated agency which has been set up, if we want to make sure that we're able to harness all of the capacity for action that we have at European level. And finally, we've got to strengthen we've got to say that France, as the President of the Council of Ministers, is going to have this at the very heart of its ambitions for the next 6 months. We understand the challenges and the difficulties that we're faced with, but we are very much attached to achieving these goals. We wanted just to remind you that it was in the G7 summit here in Paris in 1989 that the Financial Action Task Force was set up. We believe that this is a symbol of the priority which is given to this fight by the decision makers and the general public here in France. In 2000 We have already had a number of registers set up in France, the one identifying foreign trusts in 2013, and in 2016 we set up the register of beneficial ownership. We have already had tools such as TraceFin, which identified in 2020 that there is more than 700 million euros at stake in through money laundering. Our leaders are going to be also judged in our ability to actually adopt legislation which is able to cope with the new technology, to make sure that we're able to fight against documentary fraud, and enable that we're able to have proper exchange with our counterparts in other countries. But new technologies is indeed a vector of new risk, and also a way in which to carry out fraud. These transactions using digital currencies or crypto assets are going to be are going to have a bigger role in the future financial fraud and financing terrorists. We understand that there is a lot of illegal content bought by using these currencies. We also know that this is being used to also make undeclared payments or undeclared gifts of financial gifts. We see that this is also used for money laundering by using prepaid cards. It's also got an important role to play in crypto hacking and ransomware. We've seen that these currencies have increased greatly in their use over the next couple of years, and the French government, the French presidency, is committed to getting behind this. We are very, very pleased to see the regulation, which the MiCA regulation, which looks at crypto assets, which was proposed in September 2020, and we're very pleased to see that this is going to be implemented in the future in the European Union. The boom of crypto assets is something which has really taken off, and we've got to ensure that the European Union is able to fight better against financial fraud and money laundering. These are the priorities. Having stated this, I'd like to give the floor to the Commissioner, but before doing so, I'd like to thank all of the high-level experts who are here today. I'd like to thank them for their participation in the 5 round tables, which we're going to be organising through the course of the day. These discussions will enable us to look at the whole of the legislative packet, which is under negotiation right now. It'll also enable us to look at the particular threats of crypto assets, and also look at what how it can be operationally effective, and how we can get this taken on board by all economic actors. Thank you very much for your attention. I'd like to give the floor now to the Commissioner McGuinness. Commissioner McGuinness, you have the floor.
Excusez-moi. Bonjour à tous. Madame la Ministre déléguée, Monsieur.
Good morning, everybody. Ministers, delegate, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for having invited me to such an important conference for Europeans on this subject of the fight against financial crime.
I tried in French to say how really important it is that the French presidency are making this a high priority in their 6 months, because tackling financial crime and terrorist financing is a shared priority for Commission and the presidency. So I very much welcome that we're gathered here this morning and online talking about this important topic, and also that my colleague Commissioner Johansson is joining us as well. The Commission works together on this really important issue. The truth is, we need to work hard, we need to work fast and effectively to crack down on financial crime and terrorist financing. There are gaps in our system. Minister, you alluded to some of those gaps in our system. So closing those gaps is crucial to making our work more effective. Over the past few years, we've seen a string of large-scale money laundering cases involving European banks. But of course, it's not just the financial sector where problems arise, and Minister, you alluded to this issue. Investigative journalism and journalists, whistleblowers, have helped shine a light on many murky actions and transactions, including the Luanda leaks and the Pandora Papers. So we have evidence that this issue is right across the economy, and the amounts involved are very large. The estimates are that around 1% of the European Union's annual GDP is connected to suspect financial activity. What I'd like to stress, and I know that my colleague Commissioner Johansson will stress, is that the impact of dirty money is not just economic, that behind it are appalling crimes that have terrible consequences for families, for children, for communities, and indeed for countries. So it really has to stop. Ambitious action is required, and we do not need a sticking plaster here. We need to go much deeper. We need more consistent rules to protect citizens and the internal market, and we need to be alert to evolving risks and be ready to respond. And of course, we do need European-level oversight to make sure that these rules are implemented in a consistent way. So today I want to talk about how we will strengthen the EU's anti-money laundering framework and our countering terrorism financial framework. We recognise that our framework is only as strong as the weakest link, and there are those gaps that criminals continue to exploit despite our best efforts to date. So against that background, the Commission last July adopted a new anti-money laundering package. There are two main elements to this package. One, a single EU rulebook for anti-money laundering, and a new authority, a new anti-money laundering authority at the EU level. Some ask, why do we need a single rulebook? And I think the answer is in plain sight. Today, we rely too much on national transposition. And the result is a patchwork of frameworks which leads to gaps and inconsistencies which can and are being exploited by criminals. So we're not doing enough to protect our financial system. And the situation also makes it difficult for legitimate businesses to operate across borders. The new single rulebook will ensure that rules across the Union are consistent, right across the single market, and this is how it should be. So activities that carry the same risk will be covered by the same rules. There are two areas worth highlighting in the proposed new rulebook: customer due diligence and beneficial ownership. Both will be subject to more detailed rules. On customer due diligence, the private sector will have to apply the same measures across the whole of the internal market and remain vigilant to risk and act accordingly. And we're not talking here about box-ticking exercises. We will maintain a risk-based approach. We'll also increase transparency around beneficial ownership. We will extend disclosure obligations to foreign entities with business links with the internal market. And we will give EU registers of beneficial ownership the power to request extra information to carry out checks when they have doubts about the information disclosed by corporate entities. We all know that the world is becoming more and more digital, so we need to make sure that our anti-money laundering rules respond. As crypto assets gain popularity, a gap has emerged in our rules. As a result, we want all crypto asset service providers to apply EU AML rules. These providers will need to report suspicious activities to national financial intelligence units. They must ensure that crypto asset transfers are traceable, and they will be supervised. This is an important step forward, and I'm glad to see that crypto is up for discussion this afternoon. The package also brings crowdfunding service providers that are unregulated at EU level into the scope. And this will reduce the risk that funds raised through these platforms support unlawful goals. Let me move to cash. While we tackle new risks like crypto, I think we need to remember that traditional channels of money laundering exist and will prevail. Our package addresses the misuse of large sums of cash. Given its anonymity, cash remains a preferred method of money laundering. So the Commission has proposed to cap cash payments at €10,000 across the Union. We believe this limit ensures that cash remains accessible for many people and businesses that rely on it. So cash, in my view, remains king, but we need to make it much harder for criminals to use cash to launder their ill-gotten gains. The second flagship of the AML package is the new Anti-Money Laundering Authority, or AMLA for short. Consistent EU rules need EU-level supervision and oversight, and that's why we have proposed the establishment of AMLA. So AMLA will sit at the very centre of the EU's AML supervisory system. And this system will be underpinned by common methodologies and converging practices, more cooperation, and the sharing of knowledge and information. AMLA will directly supervise the most risky cross-border financial institutions. It will work hand in hand with national authorities, not replace them. Beyond the financial sector, AMLA will have indirect oversight tasks. This is an important first step in an area where risks are significant, but there is often a lack of supervision. Another task for the authority, and an equally important one, is improving how financial intelligence units work together and share information. All recent major money laundering cases in the Union had a cross-border dimension. The proposed authority will help national financial intelligence units carry out joint analysis and reports on suspicious activities. That will improve the financial intelligence available to law enforcement, and these joint reports will be extremely useful for investigations and prosecutions, with the ultimate aim of confiscating criminal assets. In the fight against dirty money, the Commission believes in a proportionate and risk-based approach. In January the 5th, the European Banking Authority issued a clear warning, which we should be mindful of today. Unwarranted de-risking can have a destructive impact on financial inclusion and the fight against dirty money. If financial institutions choose not to work with some categories of customers, that might suggest those institutions are avoiding risk, not managing it. It could inadvertently lead to some customers not having access to financial services. AML should be about managing risks, not used as an unwarranted excuse, and I think we need to be vigilant on this point. Our package discourages de-risking practices, and we count on supervisory authorities to make sure that a truly risk-based approach is implemented on the ground in Member States. Ladies and gentlemen, this package gives us a unique opportunity to fix the gaps we have identified in our system by addressing divergences and inconsistencies, to devise a fully integrated system that protects citizens and meets the needs of the internal market, and to strengthen the European Union's role internationally, in particular its work with the Financial Action Task Force. Money laundering and terrorism financing are global problems, and they demand global solutions. I'm very grateful to the Slovenian presidency for moving the discussions on our proposal forward, and I very much count, and I think I can count, on the French presidency to continue that momentum. We must ensure these proposals become law as soon as possible, and the Commission stands ready to help and support. The economic cost and the human cost of inaction is far too high. When it comes to financial crimes and tackling them, we simply cannot afford to wait. C'est à nous tous que je souhaite.
It's for all of us, and I wish all of us successful work in the months ahead. Thank you very much.
Off script, that I very much appreciate the strength of your presentation this morning, how you discussed the other risks that are emerging, and how we have an opportunity with our proposals to tackle those. So I give full support to your work, and indeed to the European Parliament as we move forward on this very important topic, which, if we leave as it is today, will lead to greater financial crimes with an enormous financial and human cost. Thank you very much.
Merci Madame la Commissaire.
Thank you very much, Commissioner. And from the Home Affairs Ministry in Paris, We will now hear from Minister Delegate with responsibility for citizenship, Marlene Schaper. Thank you very much. Good morning, everybody. Thank you very much for your participation in this French presidency event. You and we today have a broad audience. We've got professionals from the economy, from the finance sector, and good morning to Mr. Dussopt. There are also civil society organisations and crime-fighting agencies represented. I'd also like to welcome Eva Johansson, the Commissioner, for being able to take part, despite the fact that she's got a lot on her plate with migration at the moment. Two ministries have worked together to create this event in France. We've done the same in Brussels and in the French Parliament, because we have to work together, because criminals also know how to work together, and the proceeds of their crimes serve criminal organizations. So we have to act, we have to work together in a coordinated fashion in the face of this threat, not just between agencies, not just between European agencies, but also between the public and private sectors. As Minister Delegate with responsibility for citizenship, I would also like to say that our action is driven by a thought for the victims. Legal remedies and operational resources have to be put in place to protect victims. The European Union has done much in this area. After the terrorist attacks in 2018 and the Panama Papers, it created a legal framework with the 5th anti-money laundering regulation aimed at offering more transparency for financial transactions. And I would like to offer 3 targets for our presidency. First of all, better coordination between those detection agencies. The financial markets are getting more complex, they're getting bigger all the time. We've set up centres to fight radicalisation and terrorist financing in France. The second thing I'd like to focus on is regulation of the new financial technologies and tools that are being used. And thirdly, whilst being careful of what's going on in the rest of the world, I do want us to create a secure European model that will protect our citizens. I think it's something that Europeans expect of us. So first of all, reinforced cooperation. Well, first of all, I welcome the enormous work that Europol has done, helping police forces work together. And I think it's a good it's symbolic of the value added of Europe. Europe that works together and is more effective together than in separate. And I'd also like to welcome the director of the European Finance and Economic Crime Centre for being here today. If you want to break down organised crime, we have to go after their money. We've tried to do that in our ministry by setting up a directorate for the fight against financial crime, and it's very much in line with what the President and our Minister are aiming to do. They're working very closely together with financial regulatory authorities, and the Minister of Justice has also asked us to be very detailed in our investigations into the financing of terrorism, and I welcome the National Anti-Terrorist Prosecutor for being here today. I think that they will also be able to say how useful financial intelligence is in legal cases against terrorism. Next, regulating new technologies. Sometimes you see that there are terrorist financing networks that are both sophisticated and straightforward with anonymous payment means. We've got cryptocurrencies, prepaid tokens, allowing criminals to circumvent the law because they're not going through conventional financial operators. And we have to be able to trace the contacts between criminals. And I welcome the fact that internet companies are present today, because we have to work together with them in order to detect these transactions and to collect evidence. I would just say that in France, we have a tool called Pharos that we have reinforced together with the President in order to withdraw certain content online. Now let me come to the third point, which was building a European model. As Mr. Macron said in the No Money for Terror conference in 28, we need a modern approach, a clear approach as to the terrorist threat. We've made a lot of progress since then. At international level, you have Resolution 2462 of the UN Security Council, adopted on 28th of March 2019, was the first resolution against the funding of terrorism. All countries committed to make terrorist funding illegal, to reduce anonymity and to make financial transactions more traceable when they are carried out through new technologies. I think that's a resolution that's a real step forward, and now we have to build on that. I also welcome the representatives from the UN here today, particularly Ms. Delphine Chance. She'll be hosting a panel with Marcus Player from the FATF, and I think that shows the importance of these issues at international level. At European level, we consider the negotiations on the legislative package presented by the Commission in July 2021 to be very important. This recast should make it possible to consolidate the European model, which respects both people's private life and private data, but at one and the same time offers investigators new tools. We have to make crypto assets traceable. I think that that's where the direction we're going in. And Europol will expand. Their counter-terrorism centre will give us a full arsenal of tools. So, to conclude, Minister, ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests, I wish you a very constructive conference today. I think today will make it possible for us to move forward in the right direction, because here we are stronger together. Thank you.
Puis l'une des...
Thank you. And now from the front line, not far from the Baltic, now I'll give the floor to Eva Johansson, Home Affairs Commissioner from the European Commission.
Thank you very much, and good morning, everybody. Let me start by this. Criminals kill people because they want money. Terrorists want money to kill people. Different motives, but the results are the same: suffering of victims, subversion of our society, economy, and the rule of law. So I would very much thank you for organizing this important conference today at the start of the French Presidency, showing France's leading role and determination to fight financial crime and terrorist finance. And as was already mentioned by my dear colleague, Commissioner McGuinness, this is really a priority for the Commission, and we are working very close together inside the Commission. Many of you here today do a very important job. You provide the financial intelligence and analysis that law enforcement needs to keep our financial system clean and to follow the money, to bring terrorists and criminals to justice, to disrupt terrorism and organized crime. We've seen that relatively small sums of money pay for devastating terrorist attacks. Knives used in the attack in Nice or the murder of Samuel Paty cost maybe a few euros. The cost for terrorists to carry out the 2016 Brussels attacks was probably several thousand euros, but the damage to the Belgian economy was estimated to 2.4 billion euros. And the price in human sorrow is beyond measure. Terrorist groups raise funds to pay for weapons and propaganda, and to pay for their substantial operational cost, openly or hiding behind fake charities. One jihadist group launched an internet crowdfunding campaign to buy missiles, Kickstarter for terrorists. Donors could choose between types of missiles and track progress online. The Al-Qassam brigades and Al-Qaeda ran online campaigns asking for Bitcoin to fund violence. Supporters give small but numerous donations. In a recent case in France, police arrested suspects of funding jihadists with crypto coupons worth between 10 and 150 euros. Sometimes the sums are larger. Before the attack on the Capitol in Washington last year, far-right extremists in the United States received $500,000 in Bitcoin from a donor in France. These transactions leave traces that law enforcement can follow to detect and stop terrorists. That's why fighting terrorist finance is central to our EU counterterrorism agenda that I launched 1 year ago. Financial intelligence units in the member states play a key role to detect these traces, processing suspicious transactions. With the US, we have the Terrorist Finance Tracking Program. This generates tens of thousands of leads in only a few years. Advancing investigation into attacks in Stockholm, Barcelona, and Turku, and Strasbourg, Hanau, and Vienna. Another financial threat is the funding of radicalization from outside the EU. From the Commission, we are now facilitating a discussion in Member States on how to address unwelcome foreign funding that incites radicalization, hatred, discrimination, and anti-democratic ideas. Organized crime is one of the biggest threats to our society. Increasingly violent, increasingly cross-border, they are operating like multinational companies with supply lines spanning continents. Every year in the European Union, criminals generate at least 140 billion euro in criminal profits. 30 million euro, the drug trafficking is the largest criminal market. But to give you one example, in 1 year, traffickers of human beings make 40 billion euro only of sexually exploiting their victims. A criminal can sell drugs only once, but traffickers can sell a girl's body again and again and again and again. Criminals use their profits to buy weapons, to commit violent attacks on journalists and lawyers that undermine our democracies and societies. They use the criminal money to build a parallel economy offering jobs and better salaries. More than 80% of the organized crime groups infiltrate the legal economy. 80%. Laundering money on an unprecedented scale in construction companies, restaurants and hotels, wholesale and retail trade. Criminals use their money to buy people, to buy politicians, to buy power. More than 60% of criminal groups engaged in corruption in the European Union. The estimated annual cost of corruption in our union amounts to at least 180 billion euro. During this pandemic, we have seen a wave of COVID crime and COVID corruption. Last year, French police, supported by Europol, dismantled a crime group that had set up 3,600 shell companies to steal 12 million euro in fraudulent benefit claims. We also seen fake face masks, vaccines and ventilators, endangering access to life-saving healthcare. COVID corruption costs lives, and that is totally unacceptable. We need every euro, every cent for the recovery. Every single euro of European funds designed for recovery must go to rebuild our societies, economies and healthcare system, and not a cent into the pockets of the wrong people. So we must defend our EU budget. Our latest weapon in this fight is the European Public Prosecutor's Office, EPPO, which can investigate, prosecute and bring to justice crimes against the EU budget. The EPPO started its work last June. Since then, it has opened more than 500 investigations into an estimated 5 billion euro in losses to the EU budget. And we must uphold the rule of law. The best protection against corruption is a resilient society with robust institutions, independent and impartial legal systems, pluralistic media, strong investigative journalism that we heard examples of here, also mentioned by my colleague Mairead. On our next rule of law report from the Commission in July this year, we will for the first time include robust targeted country recommendations to prevent systematic corruption. To fight financial crime, to fight all organized crime, financial intelligence and financial investigations are essential. Disrupting criminal finance is the cornerstone of the strategy against organized crime that I launched last year. Financial investigations are a joint European crime fighting priority. In the EMPACT, the European Multidisciplinary Platform Against Criminal Threats, France is leading the EMPACT Operational Action Plan Against Criminal Finance and Money Laundering. Thank you for that initiative. Joint impact actions against organized property crime confiscated for 58 million euro in assets in 2020. Europol has a crucial role here, and that was underlined by Minister Schipper as well. Europol support joint operations, and with its new financial and economic crime center set up in 2020. This new center that develops tactical and strategic intelligence on financial crimes has already proven its value in boosting police cooperation. For example, by supporting a clampdown on a cocaine trafficking network in June last year, leading to the arrest of 29 suspects and the capture of 1,600 kilos of cocaine and 16 million euros. The most powerful weapon that the EU has against crime and terror is our legislation. The directive on combating terrorism criminalizes the funding of terrorists. The anti-money laundering package that Commissioner McGuinness just presented supports investigations against crime and terror, and is really crucial for this task. I have put forward a stronger mandate for Europol, making it possible for Europol to work directly with private companies, including banks, in criminal investigations. The French Presidency is committed to finalize the negotiations between Parliament and Council on this proposal, and I'm sure we will soon see their successful conclusions. And later this year, I will present proposals to make sure crime doesn't pay. Remember the vast amount of criminal profits I mentioned, at least 140 billion euro a year? Today, authorities only confiscate 1% of that criminal money. In June, I will propose a new asset recovery rules to promote the systematic launch of financial investigations, to take money from the criminals and to give it back to society, and to break the financial power of organized crime. Let me conclude by again thank the French Presidency for putting the fight against financial crime and terror financing on top of the EU agenda. Financial intelligence and financial investigations are crucial to disrupt criminals and terrorists and to keep Europe safe. I wish you a very good conference. Thank you.
Alors nous avons quelques...
Thank you, Commissioner. There are a few minutes remaining to us before we conclude our introductory session. We can discuss some of the points, therefore, that have been raised. Maybe if I can start with Commissioner McGuinness. You spoke about AMLA. Now, I've been told that that's AMLA is the correct acronym in French as well. In any case, it's the new supervision or authority for anti-money laundering. And you presented also the high ambitions you have, the great ambitions we have for AMLA. You said AMLA has to be a game changer, as you said, in order to boost the EU's ability to properly enforce the anti-money laundering legislation we have. Now, are you confident that AMLA will be sufficiently resourced, it will have a sufficiently strong mandate and sufficiently well financed to actually be able to do all that? Or will there be a mismatch, a damaging mismatch between ambitions and means? To put it in very simple terms, will AMLA have enough money to carry out its job?
Thank you for the question. Look, we're here discussing a proposal which is an extremely serious proposal about a very serious issue. And I think my colleague Johansson, Ylva, really spelled out in stark terms the consequences of inaction. When it comes to resources, there is always an issue about will we have enough? In my view, what is more important at this point is political will to make this package happen. And I understand from the French presidency and from my former colleagues in the European Parliament, there is determination. So, of course, in the initial phases, we will build up AMLA. It's a completely new authority. We want to see work begin soon so that we don't have a mismatch between completion of the legislation and AMLA coming into effect. And in my view, we have to listen to the co-legislators around potential amendments to our package, and that's really, really important. And we have to all understand that if we ask AMLA to do more, then we need more resources. But frankly, if you take account of the figures that my colleague Ylva, Commissioner Johansson, has outlined to us, the costs of inaction are enormous. So we should really always put a price on something, but maybe put a value on something. And I do think that we have had 5 iterations of our money laundering packages. Something is wrong if you've gone to number 5. This one is different because it really, for the first time, addresses the cross-European supervision, that oversight which is lacking at the moment. And in my view, whatever the resources are, and they will build towards a strong AMLA, with the existence of the authority, I believe the work of the financial intelligence units will be enhanced because we'll coordinate them better. So at the moment, we have them working in the member states. Sometimes information is shared, but it's not quite done in a coordinated way. So again, we will have additional value from the work of AMLA. So rather than at this point be anxious about resources, if you look at this issue in its totality, the resources that AMLA will need are insignificant compared to the costs of not having an anti-money laundering package or legislation that works effectively. And remember, criminals will always find a way, and it's up to us to have all of the skills necessary to address other potential weaknesses that arise. So in my view, yes, resources are important, and I will push and I will get support that there are sufficient resources. But I do believe that the added value of oversight at EU level will more than compensate for those who would be concerned about resources. Political will, in my view, is the most important, and I think we have the political will now. I may just mention one issue which I didn't in my speech. We already have legislation. Not all member states are implementing, and I wanted to say here this morning that we are determined to make sure that our existing legislation is complied with, while we're also working in parallel on this more ambitious package.
Oui, le dernier point.
Thank you. Last point you raise is an important one, because in terms of compliance monitoring, as to say, of national legislation relative to the directives and regulations, there's plenty of progress that can be made. Minister, turn to you now. In terms of the resourcing of AMLA and the potential risk of a mismatch between ambitions and means, what are your thoughts there on behalf of the French presidency? Well, I very much agree with the Commissioner and what she said. We have a common goal. That is to say that the supervision authority be set up in the first place, and that all our anti-money laundering package be transposed and applied and indeed enforced as quickly as possible in order to support what's being done. Progress has been made. We've been monitoring work. We need to look at the ensuring that all the texts enforced be completely effective, but I think having this supervisory authority will enable greater effectiveness in enforcement of the work. And so I share entirely the thoughts shared by the Commissioner in terms of resourcing in particular. Emmanuel Macron has already said the decisions need to be taken at EU level in order to provide greater resources for own resources in particular, which is another way of allowing the EU to actually fund new political instruments, new political tools. And therefore we converge entirely. We are very much partnering with the Commission and the Union more broadly. And so in the context of our presidency, France has high ambitions in terms of the kind of resources AMLA should have as of its creation. There are 2 points I wanted to stress, which are French concerns, which will also be steering or guiding our work to find a compromise. First of all is the word of the priority for independence. We consider that the executive directorship of the agency needs to be independent. This is a sine qua non in order that we can properly coordinate work and be effective in work. The second point, where we have we see a need for further work, which concerns the nature of the work being done and the type of action that AMLA needs to supervise. So we're aware that quantitative monetary criteria are good, but they're not enough. There also need to be more qualitative criteria borne in mind, and so AMLA needs to look at actions and financial flows as a function not just of the amount they represent, but also their nature. Because we know that micro flows of a few hundred euros, maybe a few tens of euros, can, in particular, be feeding into much more complex networks, particularly using new technologies. A recent case was mentioned by the Commissioner where the French authorities arrested a group of people in the Paris region who were obviously funding terrorist activities on an individual basis. So that's to say a few individuals who had travelled to the Middle East, and they were doing this via crypto assets, via prepaid cards, for example, and it was just very everyday stuff. They could buy this from a tobacconist almost, or a newsagent, and they were using this for funding terrorist activities. And so we therefore we think it's important to stop anonymous purchases of crypto assets. That's a good reason why. It also shows that IA-enabled small flows of funds can have major effects and can feed into major networks. And so that was why we take an interest in sellers or resellers, even if they're very small scale. It's important to be able to monitor them as well. And that's why I say that the amount is not the only criterion to be borne in mind. And that's also why AMLA needs to be independent, because that will be proof of its effectiveness. And as I say, the nature of what's being transferred is possibly even more important than the amount. In any case, it should not be the only criterion. Thank you. Right, well, thank you. Minister Schiappa has had to leave us, so maybe one question to round off to Commissioner Johansson. Now, there's a bit of a dilemma in terms of there's a European target, which is to combat the funding of terrorism and money laundering, but there's also another European goal, which is to protect privacy, data integrity, and all the legitimate concerns in that field, and set out in various regulations. There was a recently publicised clash between the European Data Controller and Europol. So we have a disagreement, if you like, between two European authorities as to how long Europol could collect and conserve data on potentially suspect individuals. Now, beyond that particular dilemma, that particular contradiction or clash, how, Commissioner, could you set out, I realise you only have a few minutes, but how could you see those two objectives being reconciled, and how do you see taking that forward? Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you very much for that question. I think it's extremely important because we need to have the right balance between privacy and security. And in my view, I think that we politicians have shied away from that debate for quite too long time. I think that our citizens actually expect us to find that balance. Of course, it's not always easy because we need to protect both privacy and to have efficient tools to fight criminals, for example, or what is important for me, to fight child sexual abuse, for example. But this is really why we need politicians to find that right balance, to have the right safeguards, but also to have efficient law enforcement. In this specific case that you raise, that was the executive director of Europol that find out that they now need to deal with much more processing and analyzing of big data. It's very often now in criminal cases that the national police ask Europol for support to process big data. And this is actually the core role of Europol, to support the national police with their special expertise and competence. And then the executive director of Europol went to the data protection supervisor to ask him for advice to make sure that she will be in line with the regulation and the protection. And they set up an action plan how Europol should act. And the data protection supervisor also said that the regulation need to be clarified in this aspect. That's why I proposed a renewed mandate for Europol, where we clarify the right for Europol to process big data with the right safeguards. And this proposal has now been taken on board by the co-legislator quite quick, I should say. I presented a proposal in December 2020, and we are very close to finalize the trialogue. I hope the trialogue will be finalized in a month or something like that. And then we will have the new regulation that will clarify this. So in my view, it was a bit too quick for the European data protection supervisor to act right now, when we are so close to have exactly the new regulation that he has been asking for to put in place, and that we are setting up now. So hopefully this will be clarified very soon with the conclusion of the trialogue. And I must say that both the co-legislator have been supportive of the approach from the proposal from the Commission in this specific aspect. And just one example here, we have these recent cases of EncroChat, Sky ECC, and we have a huge amount of data. In Sky ECC, we have 170 million messages between criminal on a very high level. This is extremely important that law enforcement can process this. And this is really the core role of Europol, to help and support national police when they have to process this kind of data, and to find what are the real evidence here and what is should not be used by law enforcement.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you. Thank you. One of the values of the French presidency is punctuality. So unfortunately, we are going to have to shortly conclude this introductory session in order to be on time. It's been a very strong, very detailed, very ambitious introductory session in terms of what's been set out by the various speakers, about whom I thank all of them. We will be reconvening at 10:30 for our first roundtable on convergence between rules and practices on AML-CFT within the EU. But until then, we all have a short coffee break, so see you in half an hour. Thank you.
Et là, ça marche très bien. Et là, je suis bien en anglais, ça fonctionne bien. OK.
démarre ou Ouais. Rebonjour à toutes et à tous.
Good morning again to all. We're here from Paris. We have the Ministry. We're here at the Ministry for the Economy, Finances and Recovery in Bercy, and we're going to pick up again on our discussion on the fight against money laundering and financing of terrorism. My name is Nicolas Véron, and I have the great pleasure of being able to be the moderator for this session and the next session. This session is going to be looking at the rules and practices against money laundering and the financing of terrorism within the European Union. And we're going to hear from practitioners, Ms. McGuinness and Ms. Johansson. We're also going to be hearing from others on this subject. I'm going to start with you, however, Mr. Stanislav Kuba, coming in from Prague. You are joining us from a very beautiful part of Prague, quite clearly. It looks very lovely. I would quickly like to start the discussion with you by asking you how you feel about the Commission's proposals which have been tabled and how it can be improved. Mr. Kuba, you have the floor.
Alors, il semble qu'on ait un problème de son.
It seems that we have a sound problem. We cannot hear you, Mr. Kuba. Is your microphone on?
Oui, maintenant c'est bon. Nous vous entendons.
We can hear you now.
Can you hear me now? It's okay?
Oui, nous vous entendons.
Yes, we can hear you now. You may proceed.
Okay.
We hear you.
Okay, thank you. So, good morning again, and thank you for inviting me on the conference. I'm very happy that I can present the brief opinion of me as a representative of the member states, and especially as a representative of the future presidency of EU, because nevertheless the opinion of the Czech Republic as the whole, we should always have as the presidency country in the future should find some spirit of compromise on the legislation draft of the new legislation. I maybe just start the discussion, and with some ideological opinions which are maybe same for every new regulation in EU, and both in EU and also in the national level. And this is that all new regulations, especially when we are increasing the administrative burden and creating new measures, which should be evaluated in its essence of bringing new benefits in this regulation, so improve the environment inside the EU, and it should be compared against the new administrative burden and costs of these measures, both direct. That means that we should we will have here some new offices and new administrations on the side of the government, and also the new administrative potential on the side of the private sector. And also we should evaluate the indirect cost. That means that with the IML regulation, I always understand that we should target on the transactions which are really bad, and which should harm the normal transaction, normal business transaction as less as possible. And some aspects of this package, I think, significantly improve the current measures. That means that in some aspects there is decreasing of the obligation of the private sector. So for some sectors and some businesses, it is much better than today. On the other hand, there are some new measures which should be evaluated in the spirit of the ideas which I already have presented. Nevertheless, I think that the most of this package is fully acceptable by, I think, vast majority of the member states, and we are now in the phase that we are dealing with some technical details in I think the less of this packages. So I think in the minority aspects of these packages. So there is a lot of technical work behind. There is a lot of technical work on this package, but I think we will solve it in French presidency or in our presidency, and I hope that this will be very positive issue at the end. So thank you very much for allowing me to have this speech, and also I should thank very much for the presenters in the first panel, because they directly said and presented the importance of AML legislation in the European level. Thank you very much.
Merci, Monsieur le Ministre.
Thank you very much, Minister. So we see that you're very positive about the possibilities for the French presidency and also for the Czech presidency. Now, Mr. Patrick Souet, you are the chair of the Committee on Conformity and Conduct of the French Banking Federation, and of course you're the head of the Société Générale Banking Group. So how do you think this project can be improved upon with the discussions that are ongoing in Council and elsewhere on how we finalise this legislative package? It's a very broad program. Thank you very much for giving me the floor, and thank you also to the French presidency and for allowing a banker to actually intervene now and talk about something which has been at the heart of banking activity for a number of years. This is something which is very important to us, thanks to a number of legislative measures that have been implemented, and that has changed tremendously the way in which banks work nowadays. We don't actually welcome a new client as we did 20 years ago. We don't follow transactions the same way as we did 20 years ago. So it's a huge change for banks and our practices. Indeed, we're in a very technical area right now. I don't think we've got the time now to go into all of the technicalities involved, but I know that this is something which is going to affect the daily lives of our clients, our clientele. It's not just something which affects the police or the financial security bodies, but it affects everyone, all citizens. And so I think we've got to understand the impact this is going to have and the consequences for everyone. I just wanted to stress a number of points actually included in the legislation and remind you that banks, just to give you an example, banks represent 60% of our declarations of suspect transactions from the public. So we are particularly affected by this legislation. And I draw your attention to a number of areas. Before, however, I go into them, I just wanted to say that something which is important to the banks, that the general approach for a banker when you're dealing with this project, a general approach, in the opinion, is very, very positive, and that's a good thing, because we need to have a European broad standard, which is as broad as possible. We have the European Market Union and the Capital Market Union. It's important that we have homogeneous rules on anti-money laundering legislation. There are structures, of course, which have to be organised, and if I can say, this is really going to be up to the banks to manage this themselves. But I think that this is also something which falls upon the public authorities. But the question of harmonisation of rules is a key area, the harmonisation of rules. For us, this really is the first point. I think it's going to take some time before these measures are implemented, and it's important that the transition between the present rules, because there are a lot of rules today, and the future rules, it's important that this transition is organised as well as possible, creating as little uncertainty as possible, and in particular ensuring that we do not allow national rules to continue in force when there are European rules. Our concern is that we're going to end up with a pile-up of legislation. We'll have duplicate rules at various levels. And so we're very much in favour of ensuring that we have a harmonisation of rules. We're against a cumulative set of rules. The other area that we need to pay attention to, I believe, is the whole question of how we perceive risks, how we deal with risk. We are very clear that we should have a single study of the risk by the AMLA, let's say, where we have the direct supervision of AMLA, but there has got to be a single approach, a single methodology for dealing with risk. It doesn't mean to say that member states can't have their own opinion on local risk, that's one thing, but the methodology has got to be harmonized so that behind that we are able to manage risk in a harmonized fashion. Of course, there are many other points that we need to look at as well, such as, for example, the impact that this is going to have on organizational terms, and the cost of the information systems that would be required for setting all this up. We would very much like to see a definition of what exactly we need. We need to be dealing with. What is a beneficial owner? What's an exposed politician? The rules are not the same in all European countries right now, and that's important that we get this harmonization. It's important that we're able to make sure that all of these new rules are run by machines. They're more and more intelligent, and that would bring down the cost of management of all of these new measures, because these measures do have a cost. Let's not forget that. And if we can informatize that, it's better. It's financed by the banks, so it's a cost for society, of course. But that's something which I think we should be looking at. Thank you. Thank you very much. Mr. Jens Bormann. Dr. Jens Bormann, you are the president of the German Federation of the Chamber of Notaries. So you're going to be one of the bodies which is going to come under direct surveillance under the Commission's proposal. So how does this project, how could this project be improved according to you? Well, first of all, let me thank you. I'd like to also thank the finance minister from France, for the French Republic, for having extended this invitation to me today. I am very pleased that I'm able to speak to you today, but I will indeed change, if I may, into English. That's easier for me.
As well as the banks, the full harmonization of the AML standards. We welcome the regulation as such because we believe that we need a level playing field in Europe, and we should close the loopholes which are currently obviously existing under the current regime. However, I think we should leave some leeway to the member states for gold plating, which means for maintaining very well established and also sometimes recently established systems in the fight against money laundering. And there we would call for some clarifications within the regulation. Let me give you some examples. For example, in Germany, we have introduced in October 2020 for the notaries a duty to report all cases to our national FIU in which we have certain standard risk indicators independently of suspicion in the specific case. And this has raised the number of notifications by notaries in Germany from 20 or 30 a year, which was basically nothing, to roughly about 7,000. And this has made us the group, the biggest, I would say, the notifier in the non-financial sector. We account for 60% basically of the notifications, and we would like to maintain this system, and we are not entirely sure whether we can do this under the provisions of the regulation. And this is even more true if you take a country, for example, like Spain, where the notaries have developed an own database, which includes also data from the investigation authorities, like prior convictions or current criminal investigations and prior real estate transactions. And this is an extremely efficient tool. The Spanish notaries, they notify their cases to this part of the National Council of Notaries. Then they make a kind of filter. They have a selection process. They have a staff of 10 people who are just employed to find out which are the relevant cases. And eventually, I think they have a scoring match of 70% of the cases which are actually notified to the FIU. And I think this is a very good and efficient system which should be maintained also in the future. So that would be my first demand, basically, to the Commission. And second thing, I would strongly encourage, if you set up AMLA, so as a European authority, I think it will be paramount to have stakeholders also closely involved in the process, because we are the people who are on the front of AML, and I think we know many things from our practical everyday experience, which might not be so obvious to the civil servants in Brussels.
À Bruxelles ou peut-être dans une...
In Brussels or perhaps elsewhere, indeed. As far as the AMLA is concerned, but I do understand that the question of localization is not the real issue. We're talking about the principles of it, first of all. Sean Berrigan, who's joining us from Brussels, let me turn to you. I think we've had very different viewpoints, a contrast really in positions just during this session itself. The importance of the cost-benefit, which Stanislav Kuba reminded us of, and then we have a requirement for full harmonization, or as full as possible, as from Patrick Suey, and then the opposite, we have the notaries asking us to take on board national specifications and the gold plating, which was mentioned by Mr. Bormann. So let me turn to you, Mr. Berrigan, and ask how the Commission can actually reconcile these positions and how you see this legislative text evolving. It's now in the trilogue period at the end of its journey.
Well,
Nous vous entendons.
you can hear me now.
We can hear you, yes.
Oui.
You can, yeah, good. Well, first of all, thank you very much for the invitation to be here. It's a pleasure always to discuss with experts in the field. I think before I start talking about how the text evolves in trilogue, maybe I'll just make a couple of comments about how the text has been put on the table by the Commission. I mean, it is, as the Commissioner said earlier, a very significant reform. And because of that, of course, we have to strike certain balances. We have struck balances, I think, between the EU level and the national level, which were touched upon by Stanislav. I think we've had to strike balances between improving the rules for harmonization, but also protecting fundamental rights, that was listed a little bit by Patrick. And then what Jens was mentioning, we have to, of course, find a balance between harmonization and reflecting the fact that there are differences and differences in approaches across the Union. And all of those balances we try to strike in the package. And you'll not be surprised if the Commission says that we think we struck the right balance. But of course, the Member States and the Parliament may feel differently as we go through co-legislation. I don't detect from the conversations we're having in co-legislation that there's a huge desire to change those balances. But of course, there will be discussions around the details. I was struck by what Stanislav said. I mean, I have nothing to disagree with him, just to make the point that this package was put through the Commission's better regulation process. So we are required ex ante to focus on administrative burden, identify any additional burden, measure it and justify it. And I think that we can do on the basis of what we put forward. But we would argue that what we're doing, it does add some costs. I think I heard the Commissioner admit that, but the harmonization reduces costs, because there's a huge cost, as I think Patrick has mentioned, related to differences and the inefficiencies that these differences across member states actually create for different sectors in the economy. So we would argue that in net terms, this is probably actually reducing costs rather than increasing them. I fully agree with Patrick that we will do our best to do this, to hold the maximum harmonization possible in the proposal.
We agree it has to be risk-based. We agree there has to be a common methodology. We think the AMLA is important to developing that single methodology for risk-based. So I think we're all in favor of that. But just one response to him on this is that when something is risk-based, unfortunately, another balance you have to strike is the balance between being risk-based and automation. Because automation may not allow you to make the proper risk assessment. Perhaps in the future we get to a world where IA will allow us to be extremely nuanced in terms of case-by-case assessments, but there may well, at least in the near term, be a trade-off between how defined and how refined your risk assessment can be and how automated the entire process can be. So that's going to be one of the various balances we've had to strike in the proposal. And then just on this point that Jens made about gold plating, well, as a Commission official, we always get nervous about gold plating because it means deviations from common approaches. But I think we have allowed in the proposal the possibility to go either above or below what we propose in the text. But of course, any decision to go above or below must be consistent, I think, with a common approach in terms of methodology and would have to be justified in terms of either there being a lower risk, in which case you might go below, or a higher risk, in which case we might go above. But what we have put in the proposal is our sort of standard risk framework. And we would hope that in the majority of cases, that standard framework would hold. And we have to be very careful because while gold plating is very often put in place for the best of possible reasons, it does introduce inefficiencies in the system because it reintroduces the sort of differences that we're trying to actually eliminate. So we've set a fairly high standard here. So let's be clear, we're not taking chances on the standards, but gold plating we have to be very careful of because, as I said, while they may be introduced for good reasons, we have to check those reasons are in fact correct. I'll stop there, Nicolas, and happy to come back.
Peut-être une question complémentaire.
Perhaps a follow-up question to you, John Berrigan, just to follow suit here about member states on their own initiative. Could you perhaps give us more detail on what Commissioner McGuinness said in introduction about the division of roles in terms of the regulation and the directive that has been proposed by the Commission? And we'll leave AMLA to the next panel, however.
Well, first of all, let me just strike that what we are doing, maybe I just briefly handle AMLA first. I mean, what we want to achieve with AMLA. And then I'll come back to see those parts of the legislation which we felt needed to be tightened up relative to the directive. What we want to achieve with AMLA, we do not want to replace national supervision with AMLA. I mean, that is clear. We do not intend to have a kind of EU AML supervisor in the sense of a kind of single body managing the process from wherever the member states and parliament choose to locate it. We've been very careful in our proposal to ensure that AMLA will be an added value to the system of national supervision that exists today. So it is mainly about improving the coordination, improving the consistency in approaches that will be conducted at national level. So it will give guidance to these national supervisors. It will have the right to directly supervise in specific situations, but the central role of AMLA will be to sort of enhance the coordination that exists between existing national supervisors. And that is another one of, I mean, you'll hear me use the word balance quite a lot today, because that's another one of the balances that we've had to strike. In terms of the difference between the regulation and the directive, the regulation relates primarily to the obligations for the private sector, where we want to harmonize those as far as possible. And this gets back to Patrick's point that from the banks and other providers, service providers' point of view, this harmonization is really important for their efficiency. Okay, so we wanted to give as much harmonization there. So the regulation focuses a lot on private sector, so customer due diligence, essentially. And we want to harmonize quite tightly the rules around customer due diligence to lower those inefficiencies. and also raise the overall quality across the union. So there's kind of two objectives here. One is to ensure a kind of uniform high level and eliminate differences across member states. The directive then, of course, relates much more to national public type of authorities and public systems, so the FIUs, the supervisors, and the registrars, where we leave, of course, and because of the differences in national laws, we have to leave a certain degree of freedom at the national level. So the harmonization is where we think it's most deliverable on the private sector and most effective, and then we leave a certain degree of discretion for the public authority levels, so FIUs, supervisors, and the registrars.
Merci.
Thank you very much. The Commissioner reminds us that one of the important parts of the proposal relates to cash transactions and this upper limit of €10,000. Is that the right cap? Is that the right balance, to use the term put forward by John Berrigan? Is this something that we should debate? Perhaps you could give us a feel for the atmosphere where you are. Perhaps I could go back to you first, Mr. Kuba in Prague.
Thank you very much for this question. I think this is a pretty complicated question because we have here two aspects. First is that the united limit of and cap of this transaction really helps the harmonization, probably reduce the administrative cost because the same solution is always simple and more simple than the solution based on a different limit in each member state. But the second aspect is that the value of the money is very different in each member state. So if we consider that on the most developed states in EU there is the different costs of the acquiring some things for example terrorist attacks, or the profits from the dark businesses are on much higher level than in the states which are less developed in EU. This is the aspect which should be evaluated, and there is not the win-win solution in this case at all. So we should decide on for one of these variants, and I just now presented these two aspects which we should evaluate. Surely the Czech position here, we have some opinion, but I think that is not so important because this is about the discussion, and I understand this problem on especially these two aspects. Thank you very much.
Monsieur Suet, 10 000 euros.
Mr. Suet, what about €10,000? This is not a big issue for the French banks. It's not going to be a problem for French banks. We have similar practices in place already. I just wanted to raise a point that has been raised a couple of times this morning, be it in respect to the €10,000 or new forms of transaction. We talked about different digital formats. Decentralized finance is more and more common. What regulations will be imposed on that? If you have peer-to-peer without an intermediary, how do you apply the rules? And perhaps I could ask that question of Mr. Berrigan, because we're looking for regulation on that. If you have a level playing field, it has to apply to everybody in the same sector, regardless of the type of financing. The Commission is doing a lot of legislative activity at the moment on crypto assets and digital activities. Is it your view that the anti-laundering activities, the crypto assets legislation and the regulations covering cloud services are coherent? Or do you think that there are frictions between the different areas of legislation? Or, for example, with data privacy, Commissioner Johansson has, I think, said that they haven't really solved all these problems just yet in the Commission. Well, I think that it's a bit like in business. Sometimes you have silos, and I'm sure the Commission is similar. Sometimes it's difficult to find the right route towards harmonization. What I would say is that as a user, we want consistency, and we want fair competition when the transactions are serving the same purpose. To come back on to the issue of data privacy, banks have to protect their data as well. We bear a lot of responsibility, and there are a lot of demands placed upon us. So we need data protection legislation that make certain things possible. For example, keeping certain types of data, and that needs to be covered by specific, for example, anti-money laundering legislation. And again, I think perhaps Mr. Berrigan could shed a little bit more light on that so that the different players will know more. Because we, of course, are exposed to a good deal of risk. We want personal rights to be respected, but there is a balance to be found between these two opposing interests. And of course, the Commission has to find the balance or the trade-off. But I think it's important to say that it shouldn't be the companies that try and find that balance. Mr. Borman, let me come back to you on the question of cash transactions. We've heard from Mr. Sued that it's not a big issue in France, but it is in Germany. So perhaps you could give us your view on that, if the microphone works.
Oui, donc sur la question des transactions.
Yes, on cash transactions. There's a lot of discussion about this in Germany. Goethe himself said that cash is the embodiment of freedom. So how do you see this discussion? Perhaps you could give us a feel for the debate around this issue in Germany.
At least from our point of view, from the notarial point of view, this is not a big issue, because usually the amounts which are in stake go far beyond the limit of 10,000
Ça revient à ce que disait M. Kuba sur les différents.
That's pretty much what Mr. Kuba was saying about the different value of money in each member state.
Hundred thousands or even more than 1 million or 2 million of euro are at stake. And there, of course, a standard procedure is a wire transfer. However, we agree with our government, and the new governing parties in Germany have now agreed to exclude any cash payments in real estate transactions. These cash payments do not take part, as one may imagine, that someone comes with the money to the notary. In such a case, we would immediately call in the police, because this would be a clear infraction. These so-called cash payments may take part between the parties, after the transaction is concluded, after the contract has been notarized. If there are no mortgages to be removed, and if there are no new mortgages which serve to finance the purchase price, people could, in theory, make whatever payment, and if the seller whatever confirms to the notary that he has received the money, then the transfer of property would take place. And we have now agreed with our new government to outlaw any such ways of transaction, and to insist on a wire transfer, a processing of the payment through the banks, to increase the security. However, I would say that in practice, these cases have no significance, because no one wants to bring money, whatever, through cash in practice. So I would say for us it's no problem, and we welcome any kind of outlawing cash payments. That's
Une position très claire.
That's a very clear position. Sean Berrigan, on the question of clear rules and the different purposes of different things that the Commission is doing, so protecting private data on the one hand, law and justice and policing on the other, regulation of financial transactions, etc. Could the rules be made clearer than they are today, so that the banks are not in a legal grey zone in fulfilling their reporting obligations in terms of money laundering? Or has European legislation already gone as far as it can in this respect?
Let me just come back, if I may, before I answer that I want to address the 10,000 euro, because of course this is something very important for us. We've introduced this as an upper limit, as you know, 10,000. So member states who feel that perhaps on a purchasing power adjusted basis this is very high can go lower, and some member states already have. We have a range from 500 euros, by the way, right up to above 10,000. And then some member states have no limits put in place. But again, and I keep using this word balance, we think we have struck about the right balance here. We used to have a rule that said that any transaction above 10,000 went in under the AML rules. This proved ineffective. So now we have simply said you don't transact in cash above 10,000. It is controversial, but in some member states. But again, we think we have probably found the average across all member states is about 4,500. So we think this is still a relatively high figure. And indeed, we've received as much criticism saying it's too high as we have saying it is too low. And then one other comment on decentralized finance. Someday when we have an hour, we will talk about this. But decentralized finance is an issue not just for AML regulation, but for regulation of the financial sector as a whole. Because as you all know, typically financial regulation, including AML, focuses on an intermediary, a provider of a service. And decentralized finance purports at least not to have such an intermediary. It purports to be purely peer-to-peer. We need to investigate to see if it really is peer-to-peer. But if it proves to be purely peer-to-peer, then it is going to create challenges for regulation across the piece. Now, you asked me whether or not what we are proposing, I think you asked me whether we're proposing in the AML package, it gives sufficient clarity about protecting the rights of banks and the legal protection of banks, particularly around, I assume, this clash between what we require in anti-money laundering and what the GDPR requires in terms of data privacy. This is a very tricky subject, and it's a tricky subject, again, as I was saying, not just in AML regulation, but in financial regulation across the piece, but has a particular resonance around AML, and I think Commissioner Johansson was covering some of these issues around the GDPR. The important thing to note here is that both these frameworks, the AML framework and the GDPR, are principle-based frameworks. So they do not define in great detail behavioral actual behavior. They provide principles which guide behavior. That means, of course, and I accept this, that reconciling these principles in terms of behavior is left to the individual entity, so the obliged entity in the case of AML. And that does require a degree of judgment. But they are principle-based frameworks primarily because we know that if you try to be too granular in these types of frameworks, they don't work. And there is also, if they become too granular, they become box-ticking exercises, and we don't want that either. So we have to find a degree of principle-based regulation where the entity is required to think for itself what is the right way to go. This is often not comfortable for the entities, but it is the way we know from the past. If you're going to avoid box-ticking, you have to create that sort of requirement on the entity to make its own decisions around the principles. If the principles are not sufficiently clarified, then that's an issue and we need to address it. Now, just to make a point here that we've had a very recent court decision, where one of our cases in this area was up before the ECJ, and the court has pretty much said that we have got it right in terms of the balance. They concluded it is possible to strike an appropriate balance between what we require in anti-money laundering laws and what we require in data protection laws. But we do need to respect necessity, respect proportionality, and that, of course, ultimately comes down to the entity concerned. So I know it would be much nicer if we could have a very clearly defined behavioral, every aspect of behavior is defined, but that's not the way these frameworks work. And there will always be these judgment calls to be made by the entity itself. But we think, and certainly based on the court judgment you just had yesterday or the day before, that we have kind of found that balance.
Monsieur Bormann.
Thank Thank you. Mr. Bormann. The members of the Bundesnotarkammer, the German notaries that is to say, have they seen any crypto asset transactions, and what experience do you have of that in Germany?
Whether we observe money laundering transactions.
Not money laundering in general. Crypto assets okay. In transactions that you notarize, and how that makes your business evolve?
Not yet. I would say that for us, crypto assets are not yet a problem. Our problems are rather in the sector of identification, which has nothing to do with crypto assets, but which becomes more and more also an electronic question, a question of IT. Not in Germany in itself, but in many other member states, we have recently introduced online remote procedures, online authentication. We only do it in company law. Other notaries also do it in real estate law in other countries. And there we have the problem that we have to check the IDs in a remote way, also reliably. And therefore, we have now in Germany, we have the possibility through the CAN procedure to read out the photograph and also, of course, to check the eIDAS ID of the highest level. However, we would like to have included in the eIDAS regulation, which is the toolbox for identification on the union level and which is currently revised, also the picture. Because so far, unfortunately, we only have the eID, and if you only check the eID, you can use the eID of your secretary, of your mother, of whoever. But for us, it's paramount to check whether the person who uses a certain eID is actually the person who is entitled to use it. And therefore we would strongly call to the Commission and also to the DG FISMA to have a close eye on the work of the DG Connect. This was my request to John, to ensure maybe that we get the picture and maybe also biometrics as an element, as a general element within the eIDAS regulation. Because I think that will be the future. When we have deepfakes now already regarding the pictures, we will need some biometric control in the near future, in 4 or 5 years. Otherwise, I think we will be really cheated by whatever kind of falsified eIDs.
So, if Elon Musk wants to build a second factory near Berlin, he'll need to send us a selfie and his digital fingerprints. Okay, yeah. Mr. Kuba, coming back to you on the issue of crypto assets, cryptocurrencies. The Czech Republic has been one of the countries which has observed activity in this field. Sean Berman has talked briefly about the challenge posed by peer-to-peer lending, trading, and so on in terms of regulation and supervision, and it's not just in the context of AML, obviously. From your point of view, is there anything you'd like to share with us as to how you think the EU should be thinking, taking things forward over the next few months and years on this very complex matter, that is to say, regulation of cryptocurrencies and decentralized finance?
Okay, we saw in the cryptocurrencies the problem because I think that it could be the main source to finance some very deep activities, and also this is the very good instrument to launder the dark money. Not important how I called it. We intervene here before any harmonization on EU level. So we have some experiences which were before the harmonization. Though I think the key aspect, and it is not only in the area of the cryptocurrencies, but in all areas in AML, is a good cooperation with the subjects which are obliged to report anything. So the setting, the good relation with the subjects which deal with the cryptocurrencies. It means the stocks on which this money is dealt. I think is the key element of anything we are doing here. And the legislation at EU level should go ahead this system and help the building these relations and improving the cooperation also on this level. So this is maybe the very general position, but I think a lot of in it is important and has the strong essence. Thank you.
Monsieur.
Thank you, Mr. Suet. Société Générale Group is a global business. In particular, you are active in non-European jurisdictions like the US and the UK. What's your view of the balance within the Commission's legislative proposals in terms of differentiating between different types of obliged entities, that's to say those subject to the ML regulations, between banks, non-banking financial services, and non-banking services more generally, such as accountancy, art galleries, lawyers, gaming or gambling companies, and so on. Now, what potential improvements could be made to the Commission's architecture? Now, we know that in the US has a very all-encompassing approach to banking and non-banking services, and so it'd be interesting to hear from you as someone from a global bank as to what you observe outside of the EU. It's difficult to generalize about this subject. You have a whole range of countries basically and approaches. So you have some very box-ticking approaches, that's to say where you have to pretty much declare everything from the first cent upwards, with a huge, therefore, volume in terms of reporting going on. We know our British colleagues report humongous amounts of activity. Same in Russia. 4 p.m. every day the reports are made. 4:01 you've already got a sanction being issued, and so there are certain countries which are very much like that, a very particular approach. The EU, and I think France in particular, has a slightly more sophisticated approach to AML compared even to what they have in the US. Now, the US has very specific, precise rules, very demanding rules in terms of internal compliance, i.e. within banks. On the other hand, we can't say that the US is actually overall more demanding on AML than elsewhere. However, the penalties for non-compliance can be greater. But let's not forget that takes place at a different level, under different legislation. Essentially, it falls under misuse of the dollar, which is subject to penalties and sanctions, which may also be extraterritorial. So, in some ways, it's a question for Sean. But I think the word penalty or sanction is an interesting one. AMLA, when it comes to sanctions/embargoes, is a point where it needs to be. We need some more clarity, I think. I'm not sure what the precise remit of AMLA is going to be on that particular subject. It is an important point for banks because we as banks have to deliver when it comes to compliance, whereas our role is slightly different when it comes to anti-money laundering. And so it's very difficult to compare, essentially. The approaches are so different. I think Europe, however, is in the forefront and very much more advanced than many other countries when it comes to AML. By burdening operators, banks or anyone else, with responsibilities to seek out information which are greater than you might find in other countries. That, I think, is the specific point we have in Europe. We mentioned registers earlier. Now, we think the quality of public registers and access to registers is key for us. However, the rules tell us we have to also check the contents of the registers and to correct any errors we find. Now, that creates a great responsibility on us. Now, that's to say there are public registers, but we can't trust them 100%. if you apply the European rules. So I think greater clarity would be welcome as to who is responsible for what, to what extent we have a duty to actually correct public registers. Those are the kind of questions we're asking ourselves. I know I've gone beyond the question you asked me, but they're going to be important in the future. In particular, the question of public registers is vital. We're going to need registers of politically exposed people. That would be very good if there were one. So there are plenty of areas where we're waiting for the public authorities to provide us with these services, which would make our researches, our investigations, a lot easier. And of course, it could fit within the directive. That would be even better. Very generally, to conclude, banks act in partnership with the public authorities. We have it's in our common interest that we get this right. There's nothing worse for a bank than to be caught up in an anti-money laundering affair. We've seen that reputational damage that does us in many countries in the world, and so it's a process which is give and take, and it's all about trying to improving the flow of information. So we do set great store by that. Thank you. Well, that brings me back to you, Sean Berrigan. I have, let's say, 3 questions. Number 1, the point raised by Patrick Suet, who mentioned the word explicitly the word service provided by the public services in this field, and not simply exporting all the responsibilities to the banking system, which thus leads me to the same question I asked the Commissioner earlier. That is to say, will AMLA have the right level of resourcing as that's been defined at Commission level? Or does there risk being a mismatch between what its ambition and its level of resourcing? And do you think maybe that the resources therefore would need to be increased? The second question is Patrick Suet's question, essentially about sanctions, embargoes. Could you clarify there, because that would seem to be highly relevant at the moment? And the third question is a more general one. As to say, an international comparison. Where do you think the EU fits within the international picture? Assuming that the legislation is adopted in the near future, where would the EU sit relative to its international counterparts? Are there areas where the EU will be in the forefront once the package goes through, that is, of course, compared to its international counterparts? Or are there areas where actually you are envious of other countries in the world, and where you think they're perhaps better placed than you are in combating money laundering? So if you wish to respond to those 3 questions, you have approximately 10 minutes, please, or 8 minutes, 8.5 minutes actually, before the end of the panel. If you wish to respond in your own time, please go ahead.
Thank you, Nicola. Maybe I'll take them in reverse order, because I think it makes, in a sense, more, it allows me to say a few more things. Where we fit in the world, I mean, I think, as Patrick has said, there are various different approaches. Some are extremely, I mean, Patrick used the phrase box ticking, or sort of all-encompassing. Ours is not. Ours is a little bit more, as Patrick said, a little bit more sophisticated. I don't think there's any evidence that shows these more all-encompassing, I'm not finding the right word, but these more sort of almost automatic sort of response systems actually deliver a better outcome than ours. We consider, and of course I'm talking my own shop here, but we consider our framework to be probably among the most sophisticated in the world. And there's no evidence that these more aggressive, more automatic, more all-encompassing frameworks that produce these millions of reports every day actually lead to more money laundering or terrorist financing being identified and prevented. So we think this more sophisticated approach is the better way to go. So I would probably say we are, I mean, I will never claim we're best, but we're very well positioned vis-a-vis other parts of the world. And I'm not particularly envious of them. One place I think I would be envious of the rest of it is not so much in the anti-money laundering supervision. Where I think we are a little bit short is in information, is intelligence. It's around the FIU space, which is not something we're talking about today. But I am aware that in some other jurisdictions, particularly the United States, the money laundering authorities have access, and the FIUs have access to a much wider range of information around the market than we have in Europe. And since I believe information exchange is perhaps the basic element you require information availability is the basic element you require to run an effective anti-money laundering system, I'm a little bit envious sometimes of what I hear that the US have available. But that's not something we could address directly in our package. Then in terms of this issue about, and this brings me to this point about the services and whether the public service needs to offer more or less. And this brings me back to my previous point. I don't think, I think it is teamwork, but I don't think it'll ever get to a world where you can expect the public service to kind of take over this job and do it. There is always going to be, in my opinion, a very heavy responsibility on the entity that is being overseen, being supervised, to do a large part of this job. It simply isn't possible for any public authority to have the granularity of detail or access to that detail to do the job. So I fully accept Patrick's point that, again, the word balance has to be found between what the private and public does. But I think it is pretty balanced now. I do not want to go to a world either where the private sector just ticks boxes and doesn't think and sends us everything, or a world, of course, where the public sector does all the work and there's no requirement on the private sector to think, to work out for itself what a suspicious transaction is or is not. Is AMLA adequately resourced? We think for the tasks that we're setting it in the directive and regulation, it is adequately resourced. Now, if in the future the member states or the co-legislators choose to use AMLA in a different way, perhaps to go in other directions or expand its scope or whatever, well, then we will have to discuss. But I think for what we ask it to do in the directive, what we ask it to do in the regulation, it is adequately resourced. Because what we have in mind in the regulation is, of course, maybe not what other people have in mind. I mean, we have in mind an authority which essentially, as I said, adds value to an existing system of national supervisors. So it primarily, its base function is to give guidance to national supervisors who supervise their market. It has a role in direct supervision in specific banks and in specific circumstances of risk. But it is not a case that we expect AMLA to have 500, 600, 700 banks under its direct supervision. If that's the model that people have in mind, well, then they're going to need more people. The model we have in mind is much more limited, that in any given moment in time, there will not be anything like that number of banks under direct supervision. And also banks will go into direct supervision, but also move out of direct supervision. So it's not that, you're in a Hotel California situation that once you're under AMLA, you never get out from under AMLA. So with all that in mind, the model we have proposed, the staffing of 250 that we have put it in steady state, seems to us quite reasonable. But if others have bigger ideas for what they want, then of course you would have to come back to the resources.
Si vous me permettez de...
May I just interject on that last point? Now, quite clearly, that's be more of a matter for the next session, which is all about AMLA, but you're not going to be part of that session, so if I may, I just wanted to jump in now. You mentioned banks, but I imagine that the direct field of supervision of AMLA may include non-bank financial entities, and maybe you could clarify on that point and how the Commission sees it. And in particular, we've heard several times that when it comes to the funding of terrorism, but also other money laundering activities, you may be dealing with actually quite small amounts, small-scale operators, but yet they represent major risk. And so the principle of proportionality that we had in prudential regulation is to say you assume that the biggest entities present the biggest risks doesn't actually apply when it comes to money laundering. So how does that fit in with this idea of direct supervision? We know it's going to be important in the future of AMLA. How do you see things evolving compared to the Commission's initial proposal? As briefly as you can. Thank you.
Yes, on the issue of banks, I apologize. It's because all of the work we did, of course, leading up to our proposal was based around a set of case studies, which were all banks, essentially. So I sometimes drifted with this, but it is true The AMLA will cover the financial sector, so it will cover banks and other financial institutions, insurance, etc. So you're absolutely right. I shouldn't use too much shorthand here. The other point you make about small entities being important is also a very, very valid point. Now, we have focused really on risk here, and we see one particular kind of driver of risk is complexity. So we look for complex institutions. They are the sort of institutions which kind of by default would be under direct supervision because they are too complex to be managed by a national supervisor, particularly if they're on a cross-border basis. So this might be a sort of default candidate for AMLA. But you're absolutely right that in the case studies we did, and indeed the case which probably triggered this entire discussion about changing the EU, which was a specific case in a specific small member state, the bank was very small. And so we fully recognize in the proposal that when you do risk-based analysis, it's not just on the big banks, you have to do it on the small banks as well. We have tried in the legislative proposal to give a set of criteria against which you will judge the risk of a bank. Not surprisingly, this has been the focus of a lot of discussion, particularly among the member states. We'll see what the Parliament, I expect it will be there too, because whenever you give a list of criteria, people either don't like your list or they want to add to it or take things out. So this is a very, not controversial is the wrong word, but a very, it's a part of the legislation which is receiving a lot of attention. And it's right it does so, because I think in the end, the ideal might be to leave this decision to AMLA. So leave the decision on what entities it brings under direct supervision to the authority itself. But as you know, Nicola, as well as I do, in European legislation, the co-legislators like to frame the discretion of authorities in these areas. So not fully constrain it, but frame it so that it knows, it has certain guidance on how it goes. And so we are looking at those criteria, which will allow us to capture the small bank as well, if it is very risky. And those small banks will then go under the direct supervision of it, but based on risk.
Merci beaucoup, et ceci nous fournit une...
Thank you very much, and I think that gives us an excellent introduction to the next session. So without actually further ado, and before I actually call in other panelists, I would just like to thank our panelists from this round and applaud you as well, even if it is for some of you in remote. So we've got Stanislav Kuba from Prague. We have Patrick Suet and Jens Bormann with us here in Bercy, and Sean Berrigan from Brussels. Let me thank you all. The debate will continue with the next panel. The next panel for the next session will be focusing on AMLA, the Anti-Money Laundering Authority. And for this round of discussions, let me invite Luis Garciano, Sylvie Goulard, Pierre-Manuel Comim Rodriguez, and we also have a remote connection with Edouard Fernandez Boulot from the European Central Bank. So I think we've got to have an extra seat brought up onto the platform. So I'll take a minute's break and we'll be back again immediately.
Voilà, alors nous reprenons tout de suite.
So we're going to dive right back in again with the next panel. This is coordinated as well by the French Presidency, and I would like to make sure that we have got Edouard Fernandez Boulot with us from Frankfurt, from the European Central Bank. Like as in the last session, I hope we do have Mr. Fernandez Boulot online or on video with us. I wanted to find out how the BCE, the European Central Bank, the ECB, sees the Commission's proposals from June last year for AMLA and how these proposals could be improved upon. I'm sorry, I do not see Mr. Fernandez Boulot with us on the screen, so perhaps I will actually move to another speaker and try and get someone to help us solve this problem. So perhaps we could ask Mr. Pedro Manuel Comín Rodriguez to help us look at this question. He is the director of CEPLAC, which is from the Spanish Financial Intelligence Unit, the FIU. In the meantime, I can see Mr. Fernandez Bulo actually has joined us online. So I will actually give him the floor first of all. Let me ask you, how do you feel the Commission's project or plan for the AMLAC could be improved upon? Thank you, first of all, for giving me the opportunity to actually take the floor and give you the European Central Bank's approach on this matter. It's not really part of our mission as such, but it is very important for us. So we were very, very pleased to see this project see light on anti-money laundering, because we believe that in our supervision, in our prudential supervision at a daily basis, we need to have a more convergent position on money laundering and financial stability. This is the main issue, of course, for the bank. Now, none of you will be surprised to hear that as a prudential authority, at the European level, we at the Central Bank, what we would like to see is that this European authority should, from the very beginning, have the wherewithal to ensure that it can develop a pan-European approach which is credible. So if there's one thing that I really would like to underscore on the basis of the proposals that have been put forward, one thing I think could be approved upon is to actually extend the scope of the authority. And I know that this is going to have a budgetary impact, but we must make sure that the authority has the wherewithal to really be active and present at European level, covering the whole of the Union. And therefore, we believe it should be possible for the authority to have bodies or antennae in all countries of the European Union, and that I think would be very important, so that we were able to get a clear vision, a representative vision of all of the risks across the whole of the European Union. Of course, it goes without saying that we would select these entities using objective criteria, objective risk-based criteria, the risk for the Union, for example, the importance of the transborder activities of those national entities. That plays an important role. Of course, our objective is going to be to try and ensure that from the very outset we are able to get a global view of the Union position, and to be able to see, be able to pilot the convergence process. That's really what we feel is essential and what is missing in the proposals for the AMLA. That's the first thing. Second thing, which doesn't actually require change to the proposal, it's more about this interpretation of the legislative proposal. We feel it's important that this authority is a leader, that it is not just working on the entities which are under direct supervision, but actually that it is actually got a leading role in these efforts. Thank you very much, Mr. Fernandez Bulo. Let me also say that you are one of the members of the Prudential Surveillance Committee at the Central European Bank. Now let me move to Pedro Manuel Comín Rodriguez, Director of CEPLAC, who is in charge of the anti-money laundering efforts in Spain. Let me ask you how this proposed legislation could be improved.
Firstly, before going into things that could be improved, I think that it's important to have a overall assessment about this package, and I think that is very, very positive. If I had only to highlight one particular feature, I put the stress just in that idea of jointing in only one entity these very important roles of being a supervisor, coordinate FIUs, and at the same time being the regulator. So for me, that is going to be key, just to ensure that the whole package, the whole implementation is going to be done in a successful way. And at the same time, they are using, even if you have such a big authority, all the AMLA and the other package is full of words as collaboration, cooperation, assistance. And I mean that it's also very important to that idea of a system, a system in which as important is the hub as the spokes. So just focusing on only naming things that could change, I echo the words of Eduard, but also I introduce new things as, for instance, for me it will be very important to have a common regulatory reporting to change the way in which, the second one will be just to change the way in which the selected obliged entities are decided, because I think that is not working, that binary system, and being a bit more ambitious in some parts of this reform. And I think that we can combine this ambition with an stage approach and not being that very expensive from the very beginning. Thank you.
Juste pour clarifier, vous...
Just to clarify this, you said that you think it'd be useful to change the way in which you select the entities for under direct supervision because it's too binary. Are you saying that you're talking about financial and non-financial entities, or are you thinking about the entities which come under direct surveillance by AMLA and therefore are indirectly supervised within the financial sphere?
Is that the criteria is being in or out?
But for direct supervision, you mean,
yes,
versus
I mean,
indirect?
Sorry, for direct supervision.
Okay. Sylvie Goulard, vous êtes la seule femme dans...
Sylvie Goulard, you're the only lady with us today during this session. In fact, and we didn't have any female representatives in the past panel either, so that's somewhere where I think the French presidency could improve its score. But Madame Gouillard, you're also the deputy governor of the Bank of France, and I don't know how the Bank of France actually sees an improvement of the AMLA. Well, thank you very much for inviting me today. I hope it's not simply because I'm female. Just a comment, just a quick comment, because I think we should maybe take a step backwards, and I would like to discuss this from the point of view of the Bank of France on the one hand, but also to actually mention my experience in the European Parliament when we created these supervisory bodies. Now, what are we talking about? We're talking about very, very serious matters here. It's there are penal implications, criminal implications in certain cases. It's not just that we are supervised in the activities on matters of good management or stability of banking entities, but it's actually much more important than that for the whole of society. And that's why this discussion that we're having today has got to be seen as one in which we remember that the objective of all of this is to avoid any hampering of the free circulation of things in the European Union. We want to make sure it doesn't actually benefit criminals more than the European citizens, because we created Europe in such a way that we have actually facilitated, and I think it's a good thing, we have facilitated trans-border cooperation. But when the authorities are then fragmented when it comes down to controls or carrying out supervision, then it can actually be to the detriment of the state of the rule of law, and it can actually open the path for activities which are criminal and which can finance terrorism. So I wanted to say that before we actually get into the technical discussion. So the Bank of France would actually very much welcome the creation of the AMLA. It's a very good thing. It was already said by Edward and by others, but I would actually join them in welcoming the creation of the AMLA. The other issue, though, is the one of scope. And I think if we can take an image which isn't very technical either, but let's say that there might be a lot of little poisonous snakes around. Let's say there are lots of poisonous snakes about, and we shouldn't actually be saying simply because this is at European level, we're simply looking at size as a criteria. We've got to look at the poisonous nature of this for the whole system. That's what's got to really be our guiding thread. So the reason why it's important for us to ensure that we have a European authority, and of course governance, in my view, is actually well organised in this draft from the Commission. But whether it's direct or indirect supervision, that's one thing. But we've got to ensure that no one can actually get through the net. We've got to make sure that we have not calibrated this in a certain way, saying that Europe should only be looking at the larger entities. No, they should be looking at entities which can endanger financial stability and also undermine the confidence of economic operators and citizens in the system. Luis Garicano, you're a member of the European Parliament and from the Renew Group, and you represent Spain there. You have a key role, I believe, in the re-examining of this text at the European Parliament. This is a draft which has already gone through a number of stages. So you'll be speaking on behalf of the European Parliament and also on your own terms. What type of improvements could be made?
The invitation as well, and to speak after my admirer, Madame Goulard. It's a privilege. So yes, I am the rapporteur for the opinion of the Parliament, one of the two co-rapporteurs. We haven't really started. We're just getting started. The dossier was assigned in December. What are the main things that need to improve? I agree with Edouard Fernandez-Bolo and with Mr. Comín that the one thing that is crucial is the scope. I think
scope of direct supervision again.
The direct supervision is too narrow. I think that I agree with Mr. Barron, who was saying before, okay, what his principles are and trying to make it principle-based, etc. But it's not ambitious enough. That is my basic bottom line. First, on direct supervision, only 14 or 15 entities to be supervised. I think those entities are going to get really a scarlet letter, a red mark, a stigma from being chosen. The day they're chosen, people are going to want to pull their money out because they're going to wonder what happened to them. So I think by having a very small scope and by having, in particular, one of the two articles where the criteria are enumerated, Article 13, specifically talks about banks or entities that have in the past had trouble. So they're going to be perceived as troublesome entities, and I think that's a big negative. I think a broader scope where more entities are supervised is a first priority. That means more resources as well. Again, I understand the Commission's concern to make it lean and small, but just let me, if you allow me, Nicolas, to tell you about the people who are previewed. There are 250 staff which are predicted to be there, 70 for indirect, 20 for administrative support, 5 for executive borders, 55 people doing all the non-financial sector and the FIU coordination. I mean, it seems like for the three functions that Mr. Comín was saying, it's just not enough. So second priority, more resources, more staff to do a better job. Third, I think that the focus on the non-financial sector, you were, Nicolas, asking the General Director about that, I think is wrong. I think Pandora shows us that in Pandora there were no banks that I know. I mean, I have a big expert on my side, so he can correct me. But there were no banks. It was really lawyers setting up fictitious companies with no known owners, etc. The typical beneficial ownership type issues. And finally, and the most important and the most difficult, and the one I have less of a clear view of how to proceed, is the FIU, the Financial Intelligence Unit's coordination. This is really a very soft coordinated function. So basically, the FIU initiates something, asks for help, to the other FIUs, the central AMLA passes the help request to the other FIUs, but this help request is passed on a voluntary basis, and the other FIUs can say, well, we don't really want to help, end of the story. I think that's not enough. I've talked to FIUs around the European Union. What they tell you is, well, we are very careful about our data. We don't want to kind of start spreading our information around because then it's going to leak and the politicians or the criminals or whomever it is that we're trying to investigate are going to find out. So I understand that. I understand they're jealous about their data. But on the other hand, we need to have a central FIU function which is able to knock heads and to get some actual joint European action when it's needed. So those would be my 4 resources: direct supervision, the non-financial entities, and the FIU. Those would be the priorities.
Edouard Fernandez-Bolo, je ne sais pas si vous souhaitez...
Edouard Fernandez-Bolo, I don't know whether you want to actually respond to that. The European Central Bank has got a number of obligations in this area, but on this question that was raised by Luis Garicano, how do you see this question of confidence in the FIUs and the national entities who are going to continue to work, anti-money laundering entities which are going to continue to work? How is this going to be how is this cooperation going to be organised? and how's AMLA and the European Central Bank going to be able to work together? And then there's a question of confidentiality of data. That's also a clear question. It's a real issue. We've seen this in a case. I'm thinking of a case, the Spanish case on the bank resolution in 2017. So we think that, of course, any leakages can actually be very important, very difficult for our fight against criminality. What is the balance that we can strike here? How can we improve the proposals from the Commission, and how can we strengthen proposal number 5, which is meant to be promoting confidence between member states, and also, let's say it's also meant to be help us to deal with issues where a member state may actually be the victim of this phenomenon.
Well, first of all, let me speak from the point of view of my experience as a supervisor. The ECB doesn't have direct contact with FIU, and we're not asking for that. But I think that we can extrapolate, based on our experience of the precautions that are taken, and particularly on 2 principles that I think are crucial. First of all, AMLA will have to have a proactive role. We'd very much like to see that in supervisory activity. Because of the previous European package, operational provisions allow an exchange of information between anti-laundering organisations and the ECB. So we have at the moment 57 channels of information. We don't want AMLA to become the 58th. AMLA will have to proactively manage its own role in coordinating activities in an efficient way. And it has to do that for areas beyond just direct supervision. I think it's important that AMLA aims towards unifying and harmonizing and simplifying, and that's not just about direct supervision then. So that's the first principle then. AMLA should have a proactive role to guarantee fluid communications. The second thing is tied to this, namely it has to have the resources to be able to change the practices of the national or supervisory authorities. Not add extra practice on top, but change those of the national supervisory authorities. And that's why we see this as going beyond direct supervision. Now, the FIU is something different. It's much more specific investigations. And I think that, yes, clearly that's more sensitive data. All the same, I think we have to make sure that they also contribute to the fluid exchange of information and a convergence in cooperation practices in this area. There shouldn't be less opportunity for exchanging information than between countries than previously. Pedro Manuel Comina, let me turn to the issue of access to information and the limits thereon. That's clearly a crux in a number of discussions here, including indirect supervision. Perhaps you could say a little bit more of what you expect to get out of this discussion and the way in which confidential data and the dealing with confidential data might be optimized. Thank you.
Well, the first thing that I have to say is that the current exchange between fields of information is working in a good way. So in the basis of the need of that information, this information is shared. I mean, but the setting up of the FIUs is a bit different in the sense that they have to be independent from the operational point of view. And that is for avoiding pressure, especially political pressure. So from that point of view, and because our final client is just the law enforcement agencies that, again, have this national dimension, because, well, we have, of course, we have Europol, we have other type at the European level, but with that role of coordination. I think that coordination, or through coordination, what I think, because it's clear that is the willingness to share the information, and with more resources, with more means, with one specific, in that case, the authority in charge of promote that chain, this is going to be dramatically in a much more positive way. So it's not a question of having any reluctance to share information between FIUs. That is not a problem now, and it's not going to be a problem in the future. But we have to find what to analyze, what are the most important things, in which specific places and specific cases we have to put our attention. And this is something basic, and in that case, I think that the territory authority has much to say.
Sylvie Goulard,
Sylvie Goulard, this question of European value added in the fight against anti-money laundering and terrorist financing can be seen from a number of different points of view, the political point of view, the operational point of view. What is your angle? And perhaps over and beyond the specificities of the sector, do you see AMLA transforming the European landscape and the balance between what is of the national remit and what is supernatural? Well, the first thing I would say is that the central banks need certain information, but of course we don't have the same experience that Mr. Comyn has of day-to-day work on this. What I think is important is that there is European value added in the fact that expertise and teams can be provided that aren't necessarily available in the country where the problem first arises. It might be networks, it might be a question of seeing the wood for the trees. So we can learn what other countries are doing, what methodologies they're using, and it might be also possible to send a team in who doesn't have any links on the ground, and that applies to every country in Europe. Sometimes you are, if you like, unconsciously complicit within the landscape, and I think that's sending in an independent team is important to create trust, and we have to make sure that information channels don't leak, of course. Another thing that we haven't spoken about yet is the question of crypto assets that people might be investing in. It's not about being against technology, but this is a new area. We've talked about banks, we've talked about financial stakeholders that have been subject to supervision for a long time. But here now we have a new field, and you have cyber tools that might make it possible for criminal activity to take place. So I think the scope has to be broad, not just cover traditional, conventional players. It has to also cover this new world, the metaverse, this idea of virtual avatars. What does that mean for criminality? These are all difficult areas. I don't suggest that I have an answer to these questions, but I think that together Europeans will be better able to understand how we can guard against these things, so that we at the both time allow new business and new technology, but that doesn't have unintended consequences in terms of crime. Mr. Garicano, let me ask you this question, and it comes back to the resources that AMLA will have available to it. It's not just about the legislative provisions, it's also about the practical side of things. How will AMLA set up its teams when it's created? But how do we avoid AMLA being behind technology, behind the development of new tools? How does it keep up? We have an opportunity in constructing this new agency, but how do we avoid wasting it, making sure that it's firmly fixed in the 21st century and that it is available to understand and look at the applications and the tools and the data that's out there?
That's a great question, right? And when I think of the responsibility that we are given, it's the biggest responsibility, that we are not creating an agency that is immediately obsolete. And I think that what that requires is to think well about the resourcing, which I hope we will, to think well about the location. I think the location has to be in a place that has access to a deep pool to a deep labor market, a deep pool of talent. And there have been some, I won't go into specifics, but there have been some agencies that haven't worked as well because of that. Where are they placed is an important aspect. The Commission made a big decision, and maybe Mr. Fernandez-Bolo can tell us a bit about that, which is to create this agency independently of EBA and of the ECB. Mm-hmm. And obviously the ECB, as Mr. Fernandez-Bolo will tell us, doesn't want to come anywhere near this problem. But it's a question of whether the Europeans should want the ECB to be near this problem. Maybe there should be some branch. I would personally feel more comfortable, let me put it this way. If an existing agency with existing good practices like the ECB was in some sense the parent or the grandparent of this, and there was some institutional knowledge that was transferred, and we didn't have to start from scratch. Notice that the Europol has been hampered with these judiciary decisions about data protection already, and AMLA will maybe only be operational in 27, 28. I hope money launderers are not listening, but there are going to be a few years where the capabilities in money laundering will be between countries. I mean, maybe Mr. Comín tells us, don't worry, and I would love that. But there will be some years in which there will be a hole. And those years will be much shortened if we could inherit the capabilities of an existing agency. So resources, locations, and I would hope some sort of parent that wants to take care of this child would be useful. I think that the EBA, for the reasons the General Director was saying before, was found at fault. I think if the EBA had solved Danske Bank scandal well, this wouldn't have happened. But the truth is, the governance was a disaster, and only France, of all the countries in the board of the EBA, only France voted for sanctions. So
that's now official, yeah?
I don't know if it's official, but we all know. It's official. And if this hadn't happened, then it would be the EBA. And the ECB is the other possibility. Of course, there's the Commission. I mean, we need a caring parent.
Alors, Edouard Fernandez-Bolo.
Edward Fernandez-Bolo. Would you be interested in being a sponsor or an adopted parent for this organization or this authority? Everybody wants to see the authority succeed. But the single supervision mechanism managed by the ECB was considered as an operational success. So my question is, will some of that success translate into AMLA, or will we have to start from scratch, as has been in the case for some European agencies who've had trouble building their own culture? I won't name names, but I think we can all think of some examples. Within this single supervisory system, do you think there are any elements that could answer Luis Garicano's question? Yes, this is a crucial question, and we're of course happy to have our experience benefit others. Let me answer very quickly. The ECB's mandate is a supervision one that covers the banks and its supervisory tasks. That's in the treaties. The governing board has already said we have to follow the treaties. We can't go beyond that. All the same, the ECB is very much keen to see this authority succeed, even if we're not its direct parent or grandparent. We want to see the best possible interaction between the supervisory body and AMLA so that it can work on the basis of support that the supervisory bodies offer it. And we, as the ultimate European supervisory body, are happy to do that. We want to see a framework that makes cooperation possible, and we want AMLA to use our experience and our work. So that's something we're very much in favour of. Let me perhaps give 3 quick conclusions from our work. First of all, you need a critical mass of resources. That critical mass should make it possible to exchange with all of the national supervisory authorities. Nobody should be left by the wayside or ignored. It has to be clear that we have a proactive authority here, not just a reactive one. Let me ask you a question then straight away. Of course, you're not obliged to answer, but what do you think the minimum budget and the minimum resources would be for AMLA to arrive at the critical mass that you've just mentioned? Well, I think there are other things that will determine that, a number of factors. We talked about the number of staff in banking supervision. We were assuming 700 at the beginning, and then it would increase later. Well, at the moment, there are 1,000 in the ECB. Well, there are 1,300 in Frankfurt alone, and then there are more in the national authorities, and they're really crucial, and there's far more of them, of course. Sylvie Goulard. A moment ago, you said that we've heard that the ECB is happy to see AMLA created, and indeed, I think from Daniel Nui and others at the ECB, right from 2018, have said that they want to avoid another disaster like the ABLV situation, and an authority was necessary to do that. I think Edward has already replied in part. We have legal issues surrounding the independence of the ECB. The treaties give it that independence. I remember when the SSM was created, we had a Chinese wall between supervisory and monetary activities in the ECB. This is a bit of a French-Spanish summit here. Some of the countries that aren't present. Just this panel. I'm joking, of course. But if you take Germany, for example, they have a very rigorous view of the ECB's role. We stick to the treaties, of course, but looking at what Edouard has said, ECB can offer support without any work actually be given to the ECB to do. The Commission's decided to set up an agency, and that's a choice that we can argue in favour of. Again, let me say that there are non-conventional players in the financial sector now, and they're going to become more common. We're seeing more in crypto investment, we're seeing more new technology, we've got payment systems, providers that are new. We're seeing a huge evolution in the financial sector with new players coming in, And we need to maintain the option of going beyond the banks. Of course, the banks need supervision, but that's very important. So we need legal certainty, but we need to be efficient as well, so that we can cover all of the players who might be involved in money laundering. Pedro Manuel Comín, perhaps you could give us your view on this challenge of the transition period that Luis Garicano has raised. We've got the EBA, that is the hub in the banking sector and the non-banking sector for the fight against money laundering. We've got the ECB, with the limits that Eduard Fernández-Bolo has just outlined. Perhaps you could just tell us some more about the risks linked to the transition between the two systems and how we manage that risk.
Well, I think that we have to trust. Of course, we are just giving ourselves a new framework, but we have one. And of course, because of the problems, we have to change it. But I have to say that the work done or made by the EBA, I think it's significant. And they have issued a lot of guidance that are of paramount importance just in dealing with that. The problem is that mainly you need rules, but also you need people that enforce that rules. So during this period, we are going to have national authorities. These national authorities are going to be coordinated around the EBA, so this is not a problem. And everybody, just only because we are just foreseeing the new regulation, all of us are trying to adapt ourselves to the new situation. So I think that even in this period, we are going to increase our ability just to catch up with the new things in regulation. And let me say one thing about one part that I think that is missing in the regulation. It's missing, or at least is not properly addressed in the regulation. That is data. Data is our raw material, but in both cases, intelligence and with supervision. As you know, in Spain, the FIU and the supervisor is inside the same institution. In that case, the CEPLAC. And what we have seen is a lot of synergies between both parts. So there are information that goes from the supervisor to the FIU and in the other way around, on the contrary, from the FIU to the supervisor. Of course, in that case, we are not speaking about specific cases with specific names, but for instance, if they are detecting a lot of suspicious activity report that involve theft, identity theft, is something that is important because it has to do, for instance, with customer due diligence, and perhaps the remote onboarding is not done in a proper way. So we need information, we need the synergies between all those institutions. And at the same time, we need information in supervision. Many of that comes in a regular basis from the FIU, because suspicious activity report are just, we are receiving many of them, 1,000 in a year, about mainly credit institutions. So we have a clear view in these obliged entities. But at the same time, and it's in the new regulation, information is needed for carrying out the risk assessment and also for qualifying as high risk, low risk, medium risk, substantial risk, both inherent risk and residual risk. I have to say that inherent risk, there is nothing related with a stigma. A stigma is in the residual risk. If you have a huge inherent risk, but very good controls, there is no problem. And the selection process is based in inherent risk. So it's not as easy to associate that stigma. Of course, it could happen. And I think that it's very important that this new institution just develop a kind of regulatory statement with granular information of the activity. I mean, the activity in terms of anti-money laundering of the entities related with customer due diligence, reporting reports, internal controls, because it's the way in which you can act, you can carry out your ongoing off-site supervision. And this is out. And it's very important to have the same regulatory information for the whole system. Because, of course, in the very first moment, it's going to be just expensive for the banks and for the institution. But the next time is going to be just straightforward. So it's important, the quality and the need to data, but with this data you can use not only as direct supervisor, but also as indirect supervisor. So you can use this data, and this data is needed. So for me, this is an important part. And just to finish with one idea, it's important to broaden the scope. I think that we need direct supervision, for instance, with crypto asset service provider. And we can discard that in the future appear over with high risk. So why just saying that only financial institutions could be submitted to direct supervision? There is no point, especially for the future, and especially because it's important also to have that power to step in to take over the supervision of institutions that are creating big problems at the European level. Thank you.
Luis Garicano.
Luis Garicano, that's a very broad programme, plenty of work for you as a rapporteur coming up. And as Pedro Manuel Comín has just said, data is going to be a key and indeed thorny subject. We've mentioned this already this morning in our earlier session. This tension, this dilemma, if you like, between one key goal in Europe, which is to protect privacy and personal data, to have a good oversight and of the use of that data and limit misuse in terms of collection and further use of such data. But we also know there is another key objective of the EU, particularly in the context of anti-money laundering and combating terrorism. We have to try and fight criminal practice. And okay, there is, I think, a fairly obvious tension there. Politicians' job is to try and resolve that. How do you see things? How are you going to structure the work within the European Parliament to deal with this Gordian knot, as it were, and try and find the best possible way, or perhaps the least worst way, of dealing with it?
It's a great question. It's probably the most complicated question. I think Mr. Comín is right to raise it, and you're right to raise it. Let me just say one thing about what Mr. Comín said on the scope. So right now, for you to be inside the scope of the regulation that, as the Commission proposes, there's Article 13 that says, well, there's Article 12 that says one financial institution has to be established in 7 member states or established in 2 but active in 8. That seems like the wrong thing. I mean, I don't think that being in 7 member states is particularly good criterion. I think the Commission agrees. I also think the fact that it says financial institution is wrong. So 2 ways that the scope has to be changed. The reason for the stigma, Mr. Comín, was then in Article 13, it says among the institutions assessed, the AMLA would pick those that would have high inherent risk profile in at least member states and have been under supervisory or other investigation for material breaches of AML rules. So there is really a stigma. I mean, there, all the bad guys are put together under the AMLA, and when you're put in under the second part, which is high inherent risk profile, people are going to be thinking you might be a bad guy as well. So I think that's the reason for my worry about the stigma. But I completely share your view that we need to think about crypto 100%, to expand the scope beyond those with 7 member states, which I don't think is particularly interesting, and to consider other parameters of risk. Now, data. Data is really, really, and Nikolai is completely right. It's a huge challenge because we have given ourselves a framework, the GDPR, and a regulator who's pretty aggressive in data protection. I think it's good. European citizens want data to be very well taken into account. But like everything in life, we see it in COVID every day, there are trade-offs. And it's not just all about data. Data is part, there are security and data protection and privacy, but there's also criminality. And I think Sylvie Goulart said it very, very well when she said, look, I mean, what we cannot have is a single market that is helpful for the criminals to just find the ways around the rules. So that's shows the need for balance. So what am I going to do and how are we going to deal with it? I can tell you that I find it extremely difficult, personally, how are we going to kind of push GDPR in the direction of allowing this? And the way I have done it is I have actually hired what I consider the best expert on the field to help us kind of try to get this intersection, and she's going to give us a report to the Parliament in a few weeks. So we will learn if we have space in the intersection to get some better to push this data regulation in the direction of not stopping AMLA from being effective. I think the sense that one gets from Europol is that this regulation has actually been hampering their activities. And I think that we need to move that trade-off in the direction, in my opinion, of ensuring that FIUs can share data. For example, just to give you one simple example, the banks tell us that they can observe when their customers have actually some suspicious movement between, let's say, Holland and France, let's say the Netherlands and France. They cannot do anything with information because it's cross-country and they cannot kind of tell their French anything, their Dutch anything about this. So there is information that is being lost. And I think we need to move a bit the boundary.
Could you perhaps explain to us the Europol affair and the European data protection issues and control of data protection? Because Ylva Johansson, Commissioner Johansson mentioned this in the opening section. What lessons can we learn from that particular affair? Was the Commission's response sufficient? Because it's very much linked to what we've said today.
The Europol people just left, so I mean, I'm loath to be the one talking.
You're the one on the panel, so you know.
Yes, yes. You're I mean, I think the fact that they have to throw away the information very soon after they collect it, and they cannot keep it, and they can, I mean, 6 months now. I think with the regulation they were mentioned this morning, I think it moves to 18 months. I mean, I think the sense is that this is hampering the investigations. But I don't know. I really don't know how we allow inside the legal framework we have. I mean, the General Director said something very important. This is principle-based. So it's not the general framework that says no data on this can be shared, right? It's a general framework that needs to be interpreted. And there is a principle that justifies privacy, but there is also a principle that justifies the fight against criminality. And my hope is that the agencies, the two agencies, the one that we have already created for data and the one that we're going to create for anti-money laundering, will be able to work around those limits. But I can honestly, Nicola, not right now tell you what the solution is, because this is the place where I find it technically, and I think the Commission also did, because as Mr. Comín said, there is nothing there. I find it technically, from a legal perspective, more complex to explore that complicated area.
Edouard
Fernandez-Bolo, there's one aspect where the SSM, in which you're involved through the ECB, takes a direct interest in this financial integrity matter. That's to say, the oversight you exercise in the appointment of bank directors being fit and proper, the fit and proper test in the context of the SSM. Now, what's been the learning curve of the ECB in applying that, and are there any lessons we can learn from it as AMLA comes on stream? Well, outside of AML and unconnected with that, the ECB is attaching greater and greater importance to this importance and investing in it. For example, we are looking to promote diversity in the makeup of teams in terms of experience and the technical capabilities of banks' boards. And so we are in the process of conducting a consultation on that. So we're trying to improve and update our approach, such as to take a more all-encompassing view when assessing appointees as being fit and proper or not. However, you're correct to point out that anti-money laundering is a particularly thorny, particularly delicate matter, and that is the point where we really, really need very successful, fluid cooperation with the AML authorities, because it seems pointless for us to re-perform the same tests, albeit with more limited resources, that those authorities may already have carried out, looking at the background, the lives and details and credentials of the individuals in question. And so that's why proactively we need the AML authorities to provide us with data, because at the end of the day we take the final decision to accept individuals or not on banks' boards, but we require information to do that. Thank you. Okay, coming up to the end of this very useful session, I have a question for all three of our panelists that Edward Fernandez-Bolo has already basically answered, so let's ask it to the other three participants. I'll start with you, Mr. Comín. It's the same question to all three of you. What is the level of resourcing, both in terms of staff numbers and money, AMLA need for its initial dimensions in order to meet the ambitions and the targets it's been set?
Well, let me answer in an indirect way. In Spain, we are around 200 people just dealing with that problem, taking into account not only CEPLAC, but other supervisors and also our treasury department.
Et en incluant la cellule.
What about the FIU part? Is that with the FIU or without?
So, 200. In prudential supervision, we are 500. Comparing with the figures that Mr. Fernandez-Bolo has said before, in supervision, prudential supervision at the ECB level is just more than the double that at the national level. Here, it's not going to be the same. But let me insist in that staged approach. It's not a question of having 800 from the very first moment. I think if we, instead of having this binary in or out, we have just an scoring, a compound scoring, with really identify the highest inherent risk institution, you can choose, for instance, in the first year, the first 20, the second year, taking advantage of the learning curve, 20 more. So, but I think that when you reach just the peak, I think that it's needed around 500 to 600. It's my personal guess.
Sylvie Goulard.
Sylvie Goulard. Well, for Banque de France, I don't think there's any point putting a specific number on it. We've all said that the issue of scope, what is the agency going to do? That's the key question, and that is a function of that. As a function of that, we need to know, we'll define what resources it needs. I think we should also take inspiration from the experience of banking supervision is to have mixed teams, both for direct and indirect supervision. We need European teams working in conjunction, so you could have mixed teams using resources available in member states, training people up to improve the standard. Now, we've all said that we want this to be a success, which requires, therefore, that the necessary resources be put in place. Luis Garicano for the European Parliament.
Mr. Comín is right. I would say twice the current 250, twice the current 46 million, so more like 100 million, 500, 600. but I think his stage approach is very good. I also think the mixed teams idea is exactly right, that we have to give more scope for that collaboration and those national resources. I wanted to say something else, which is it's a bit off topic from what you said, but I do want to add it. I think the role of the UK here is essential. I mean, if we put together all the Crown territories and all the Her Majesties, all the other kind of in-between things which are in but not out, and they kind of manage to get a bit of all worlds, the UK would be the first in the tax haven list, and it would be the first in the anti-money laundering thing rankings. So we have now a huge negotiation to do about financial sector equivalence, etc. And I don't think we can succeed here if we don't manage to solve that problem. I mean, Europe needs to act forcefully to have our house in order, but the house of our immediate neighbors cannot be a mess, because then the cockroaches are going to be coming under the door.
Non, mais enfin, Louis a extrêmement raison.
Louis is completely right to say that about the UK, but more generally, it covers the G20 as a whole. Finance is global, and crime is global. It already is. Terrorism is global. This is something we shouldn't lose sight of when we're designing legislation. Obviously, we legislate for our own area. Of course, that covers the EU, the single market, of course, plus a few extra members, plus the micro territories, which are a very close relationship with the EU, which not all of whom are crown dependencies. Some of them belong to other countries, don't they? Nudge, nudge, wink, wink. Indeed. So thank you all for this very interesting, lively discussion. We'd have loved to take it longer, but it's lunchtime, so we have to leave it there. Thank you to Pedro Manuel Comín, Luis Garicano, Edouard Fernandez-Bolo, and Sylvie Goulard. There will be a session for accredited individuals only, starting at 2 p.m. The public programme continues at 3 p.m. with a panel on crypto assets. Thank you, everybody. Enjoy your lunch for those for whom it is lunchtime, and see you this afternoon.